is finding it easy problem to resolve. But one country has actually cracked it. I'm referring to Australia. What happened at the beginning of this century was that people came from Papua New Guinea in small and quite large boats in some cases to the northern shores of Queensland. The then Liberal government decided that the way to tackle this was to pass an amendment to his existing migration legislation, not dissimilar to the one that my noble friend is introducing today, and at the same time establish radically and newly an overseas processing centre in the island of Nauru in the Solomon Islands. The boat stopped coming. That was the end of the matter. Subsequently, the Labour government came in and dismantled, which had opposed all of this, interesting enough, opposed all of this, dismantled it, and there was a second wave of boats came through. The Labour government then changed tack and began to implement the Liberal policies which it previously opposed. Too late. There was a general election and the Liberal government was returned on a policy called sovereign boats and sovereign national sovereignty. And then, as a result of that, it produced a more thoroughgoing version of the original policies. As a result of that, the Labour government changed its tune, and that policy, which did stop the boats completely, has cross-party support. And on the basis of that, Australia has produced a very methodical and rational, totally cross-party support on population, immigration, looking at the number of people each year it wants to allow into the country, those who want to come in to students, those who want to come in for family reasons, those who want to come to work and so forth. It's debated, an annual debate, a whole day's debate in Parliament, rather like the debate we're having at the moment, and then decisions are made and the policy is implemented. And it can go up or down. The latest interest is that the new Labour government has decided to increase the level of migration. It can go up and down, but within a framework which is has cross-party support and is solidly supported. Obviously, I wouldn't pretend that there's big differences between Australia and this country. Obviously, that is so. And legal differences and geographical differences. But nonetheless, it's important to look not just parochially at what we do, but across the world of what is being done. It does seem to me that they have done something very wise that we could well implement. And the thing, I talked to them at some length over the last year about how they did it. And what they did do stress to me, it was essential that they did deny to illegal migrants the possibility of being an asylum seeker. They denied it to them. And secondly, they can transfer them to the Solomon Islands, to the Overseas Processing Centre at great speed. And that essentially is what we are trying to do here, turn the situation around very rapidly within the framework of British laws, which are different from Australian laws. Now, those who are opposing the government's policy tend to argue that we need new pathways for legal immigration, and I entirely agree. What we have at the moment is rather unsatisfactory, and it's too specific to particular countries, it's too narrow, and we need to expand it and have it a more rational approach. But the truth is, we need to do that, and we also need policies to deter. We need both. We need a belt and braces, to use a Lancastrian phrase. We need a belt and braces approach to this, otherwise we will not succeed. I made this point, incidentally, when we had a debate on December the 9th, which the Archbishop of Canterbury initiated. Good for him, because we do need debates on this subject of immigration. And he argued that it was right to have more legal pathways, because if you did have a new low-cost way of getting here, it would demolish the model of the traffickers. They would no longer be in business. Sadly, that is not the case. As my noble friend Lord Howard pointed out early in this debate, if you get a new way of coming here, the people who don't get onto that route will find a way of coming via the private method, either because they can't get onto the route, or they don't want to get onto the route, or they find it more congenial to come via private methods. Whatever it is, you will not kill off the traffickers' trade if you simply offer more legal routes. You have to have a deterrent as well. There's also a bigger picture, I think we also have to mention, which sometimes the Noble Lord Paddick mentions rightly. This is a small number. The big numbers are the 700,000 or so people who are coming across legally, and we have to look at them and take up the bigger picture. And I'm sure my noble friend Lord Hodgson will elucidate it in his remarks. We do need to look at that bigger picture. This is a small beginning, but if we can get this right and get public trust back, then we can also tackle the bigger problem.
My lords, my noble friend Lord Hoare always talks a lot of good sense, and I'm very pleased to be able to follow him. The House will be aware that I have a long-standing interest in about absolute numbers, that there is a number that this country can sustain, either permanently or can absorb on an annual basis. It's not so much where they come from, what they are, it's just the fact they are people and they make demands on our space, whatever our space may be. And so it will come as no surprise to noble lords that a bill like this, which in Clause 1 offers the primary objective of restricting illegal migration in this country, has my support and offers, it seems to me, to offer a good line of approach. Now, I'm aware, very much aware, that this leads to one being described at best as heartless. I have to say, my lords, I reject that. I'm as aware as any member of the House what dreadful circumstances many other countries and citizens of other countries live. Nevertheless, however difficult, however painful, we have to set this whole issue in context. Because sadly, the debate about levels of migration, which are inevitable as a result of an increase in our population, have become rather lopsided, dominated by two groups, both of which favour increasing the rate. The first can be described as the moral case, which is the underlying background to a lot of speeches today, and the other is the economic case of people to fill jobs. Let me quote from a recent magazine article, and I quote, "The left hates talking about immigration because it thinks any kind of controls anywhere are racist. The right has been running an economy depending in part on endless reserves of imported labour, which it doesn't like talking about. However, few things are more corrosive to the public trust than pretending a problem isn't there. Sooner or later, the public notices." Where did that come from? It is Mr. Andrew Marr in the New Statesman of this week. Now, I don't often quote the New Statesman and Mr. Andrew Marr with approval, but I have to say I think they've got this bang on the button. Now, of course, both the arguments have merit, but what is lacking is any counter view expressed on behalf of the 67.3 million people already settled here, 18% of whom come from minority ethnic groups. Their concerns are, of course, include economic worries, but also a wide range of what I call quality of life factors. Access to open space, damage to our ecology and our environment, ability to achieve our climate change goals, our future food and water security, increased pressure on education, health and social services, and our impact on social cohesion generally. In February this year, I commissioned some polling on these points, and if any member of your Lordship's House would like to send the polling, I'll happily send them to them. It revealed that across all ages, all social grades, all regions of the United Kingdom, and all voting preferences, about 60% were concerned about future population growth. 51% thought there should be a cap on the level of net migration, and over 60% were concerned that the government had no plan in place to consider this. Since the Blair government first allowed, perhaps encouraged, large-scale migration, the population of the UK has gone up by 8 million people, equivalent to 3 cities the size of Manchester. As year has succeeded to year, governments, including my own, have explained away the successively higher figures as being a series of one-off events. But these one-off events have kept on coming, and the British people have been presented with a series of fait accompli. And if we as a Parliament do not find ways to address these concerns, wider and less attractive spirits will inevitably begin to make the running. In addition to the general direction of travel, this bill begins to address the problem in two specific ways. First, in Clause 51, for the first time, instituting a total cap on numbers, a cap which will be drawn up after consultation with local authorities and be debated in Parliament. And in this connection, I would like to pay a very sincere tribute to Stephen Kinnock, the opposition spokesman in the House of Commons during the committee stage when he gave the Labour Party support to the idea of a cap. And secondly, the bill offers fairness. There will be no reward or advantage for an economic migrant getting on a boat to cross the channel and so jump the queue. The British people as a whole are generous, but they also place a good deal of reliance on fairness, and the bill offers this. To conclude, my lords, the House can take one of two approaches. It can follow the line of Lord Paddick and deny the existence of any problem, or at least deny the existence if only people like Lord Hodgson would stop talking about it, and attempt to water down the bill so it becomes ineffective, or it can recognise the very deeply held views and concerns of our fellow citizens and work to ensure that we respond to them.
Four consecutive Conservative speakers, and with respect, I have more in common with the first of those four, with Baroness Hellich, than I have with the subsequent three. Baroness Hellich rightly quoted the statement that Lord Murray repeated in this chamber on the 8th of March. And let me quote from Hansard, from the Minister, repeating the statement. "Let us be honest. By some counts, there are 100 million people around the world who could qualify for protection under our current laws. Let us be clear, they are coming here." But this was not honest, and the Minister clarified and corrected the record later in the proceedings. Globally, at the end of 2022, there were 101 million forcibly displaced people around the world, the majority of which are internally displaced within their own countries, support for which the UK has slashed humanitarian assistance to by up to 60%. Global figures of those seeking asylum is 4.9 million. They are still not coming here. But the 1% who are seeking come here against a narrative which my noble friend Baroness Kramer so eloquently pointed out, that states that they have values that are at odds with us, or that they will cannibalise our society. But now we are being asked to ban claims of asylum because of the method of their arrival, rather than the merits of their claim. The House of Commons library showed that the percentage of asylum applicants refused at initial decision reached its high point in 2004 at 88%. Since then, the refusal rate has been falling overall and was just 24% in 2022, its lowest point since 1990. So much of this debate has been saying we have an emergency crisis now, but we have the most successful level of asylum, justified asylum, in 30 years. Now, for some on the opposite benches, we say that this is because of judicial activism. But as the noble and lauded Lord Etherton said at the commencement of this debate, we actually have tighter restrictions now than we ever have. So if you are a young Iranian woman threatened to be poisoned in a college, or a young Sudanese woman fleeing threats of rape from the Wagner group in Sudan, the government now is banning asylum from them because there are no safe and legal routes from those two countries. And the government needs to be clear. There are no safe and legal routes, but their obfuscation comes time and time again. I think the government does find it hard to defend the lack of safe and legal routes. That's why they are obfuscating. The Minister has stated in this debate at the start, and he declined to take an intervention from me, but he referred, as Lord Ahmed had, who I greatly respect, references to the global scheme, the UK Resettlement for Vulnerable Refugees scheme, and say this is open to anyone from around the world. But what the government doesn't say is that this is operated through the UNHCR. But the government doesn't say that the Home Office has asked the UNHCR to have that scheme prioritised for Afghans only. So therefore, it is limiting it for others. The Independent Commission for Aid Impact, who did a review, said, and I quote from their report in March, As a result, the UKRS has almost completely ceased processing vulnerable refugees for resettlement to the UK, in effect closing a rare, safe and legal route to seek protection in the UK for refugees who do not fall under a nationality-based scheme. Not only are we asked to, for the first time in our nation's history, to end the ability to claim asylum, we are reducing UK support in the very troubled areas people are seeking safety from. And the government doesn't believe that there are consequences for this either. So I want to raise something not yet mentioned in the debate today. In the 1990s, the UK opposed scoring in-country support for refugees as overseas development assistance. But this is allowed for under ODA rules. 10 years ago, this was a negligible amount. In 2021, it made up 9% of all UK ODA, and ICAI estimates that now this is 1/3, because the government, unique amongst all developed nations, is scoring all of the domestic support under overseas development assistance. This means that we are now, for the first time, spending more overseas aid in the UK than on bilateral programmes addressing the root causes of the issues that we've been debating in this debate today. And because of the unlawful 0.5% cuts, this is now capped. It means that when the government and the minister says that the country is generous and welcome, I agree with them, it is that. But if you seek asylum, a shelter in a storm, as Churchill described it, and if you are a child who's doing so, you will be denied and you will be locked up before you are sent away. And we won't even listen to your case. And generous. Well, let me tell the House that when it came to the Ukraine scheme, the government trumpeted, quite rightly, its thank you payments for families, £350, which has now been increased, per family hosting a Ukrainian refugee. This has scored 100% on overseas development assistance, which means that the government doesn't tell the family that that thank you payment has been cut from children starving in hunger in the Horn of Africa or those who are fleeing conflict abroad. I think the government knows that the public are not on this side. That's why they're not telling the full picture. This bill has no moral basis. We should not be legislating for it, and we are causing more damage around the world, which will make the problem even greater.
Yeah. My Lords, I think we can all agree that this is a complicated and contentious issue which generates strong views. But maybe we could start with a part of this bill with which there may be some agreement. The government's indication that it wants to consider opening more safe legal routes for those in genuine need of asylum in this country. The bill states that once passed and the number of illegal migrants starts to fall, the government intends to look at possible new safe routes. An annual cap will be agreed each year in consultation with local authorities to determine what capacity there is, which is vital. But in the event of any humanitarian emergency, it's made quite clear the cap can, of course, be amended. This is surely as it should be, providing as much safety and support for those having to flee from threats, violence and maltreatment as we have the capacity to manage. But the biggest obstacle to this is the growing number of illegal migrants who arrive here, some in lorries but mostly in boats these days. If caught trying to enter the country, and many are not, they often claim to be under threat in their home country, when in fact they are economic migrants intent on taking advantage of what this country can offer. They pay huge sums of money to people smugglers to get them here, travelling through safe countries on the way. Why don't they seek the right to settle in them? And then jumping the queues of those in genuine need who have been waiting their turn to come here. The number of illegal migrants has quadrupled in the last 4 years. Last year, around 45,000 illegal migrants arrived by boat. That's slightly more than the equivalent population of 2 Cirencesters, the town near to where I live. So if we don't control our borders better, how will we keep finding more and more space every year, equivalent to 2 Cirencesters, to build extra accommodation for that number of illegal migrants which is increasing every year? Meanwhile, we read almost daily in our newspapers about a growing housing shortage. It's becoming a serious problem. So regarding our immigrant numbers in this context, there are those who are here legally and require housing, some 500,000 net over the past 7 years, which is a major added pressure. But there are also those many thousands who have no legal right to be here. They also have to be accommodated while their claims slowly work their way through the legal system at huge extra cost and no benefit to the taxpayer. This is an example of how illegal immigration makes it more difficult for this country to make provision for those genuine legal asylum seekers who we want to support. My lords, we must put the people smugglers who encourage illegal migrancy out of business. Enforcing new laws laid out in this bill would permit speedy removal of all those illegal migrants they have brought here. As a result, fewer and fewer of their passengers would think that what the smugglers offer would be worth the huge amount of money they charge to bring them here. And the dangerous risks attached to the journey wouldn't be worth it either. The Prime Minister told a news conference back in March that since a deal was agreed with the Albanian government to take back Albanian illegal migrants, whom we now fly back promptly, the number of Albanians coming here illegally has already fallen significantly. The change in the law to allow the prompt removal of illegal migrants from this country is central to how we go forward. They will either be flown straight back home, if safe, or to Rwanda, which has been identified as a suitable alternative if they don't wish to return to their country of origin. Outstanding legal claims to live here in the UK will have to be taken up from where the claimants are resettled. I would like to echo the concerns expressed by my noble friend Lord Sandhurst about the proposals concerning modern slavery, however. And I would like to ask my noble friend, the Minister, if there is a possibility those proposals can be reconsidered so that those already victims of modern slavery in this country can safely report their condition without being sent home. Finally, my lords, the general purpose of this bill is to deter illegal migrants from setting out in the first place, and no legal entry will be granted except in special circumstances to those who have already tried to enter illegally previously. We must deter them from trying and stop the smugglers making money out of misery. We need to change the law to do so. We cannot leave things as they are.
In this debate, the Noble Lord the Minister said, "Our broken asylum system is costing the country some £3 billion a year." I thought I'd look up the list of Home Secretaries since the 12th of May 2010. Theresa May, Amber Rudd, Sajid Javid, Priti Patel, Sheila Braverman, Grant Shapps and Suella Braverman again. Which one of those does the Noble Lord the Minister hold responsible for our self-described broken asylum system? Or all of them? Now, my noble friend Baroness Jones of Moleskins covered the general horrors of this indefensible bill. I'm going to focus on some of the actual people, the individuals who will be caught by it, who will be subjected to what can only be described as utterly unacceptable, inhumane, abusive treatment. Now, the Noble Lord the Minister in the introduction said 70% of the children arriving are aged over 16, so they would only spend 2 years or less warehoused here in the UK before the time for happy birthday, your present is a deportation flight. Of course, that means that 30% of cases will be facing more than 2 years in that situation of warehousing. An 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old. What would such a situation, the full knowledge of such a fate, do to their health and well-being? That treatment breaks the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is only a statement of the obvious. Now, as noble ladies Baroness Lister and Sugg and others have highlighted, pregnant refugees are also trapped by this bill. The small but important victory won by cross-party campaigns in 2016 to exclude them from immigration detention wiped out. Yep. Their babies will be born into indefinite detention. How long will they stay in that situation? How inhuman is the government prepared to be? Now, people with mental health conditions, refugees who arrived here with conditions often induced by torture or war, who develop them as a result of our hostile environment. A direct question to the Noble Lord the Minister: has he read the detailed forensic examination of the impacts of Bill from the Royal College of Psychiatrists? It quotes the Shaw Review that immigration detention has a negative impact on detainees' mental health, and the impact on mental health increases the longer detention continues. Now, as many noble lords have said, there's the victims of modern slavery and trafficking. And this Royal College report points out how frequently they understandably suffer from difficult to treat complex PTSD. What will the indefinite detention or removal to Rwanda do to them? And picking up that group, I'm indebted to the noble Lady Baroness Kennedy of the Shores for some information from an impeccable source, unpublished Home Office information, that shows there is already an outrageous, persistent slavery survivor protection gap. Of the 11,137 confirmed cases of trafficking and modern slavery survivors referred for consideration for discretionary leave to remain in the 6 years and 9 months from April 16 to December 22, I'll repeat the figure, 11,137, only 738, 7%, have been granted leave to remain. Far from refugees gaming the system, we have a system that already is a lottery, and what this bill does is takes away any chance for those people to establish a secure life for themselves. Now, picking up again, focusing on people who will particularly suffer under this bill, as the noble Lord Etherton said, LGBTIQA+ refugees. Rwanda is not safe for them, nor are many of the other theoretical countries to which they might be shipped. Now, some might say that the people I have listed who are particularly vulnerable are not the majority of refugees who reach our shores by non-orderly means. As the noble Lord the Minister said, an overwhelming majority of the arrivals were adult males under the age of 40. That's a fact. Men like the refugee now settled in Norway to whom the noble Lord Paddick referred. But what did the benches opposite have against young men? Most of them were young men once.
Not anymore.
I finish with a couple of general points arising from the debate. First, as Baroness Prasher said, asylum is a collective responsibility of all states. As the UNHCR, as the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, among many others, have pointed out, if other nations followed the lead of this bill, there would be a breakdown in the international system of refuge. Secondly, again highlighting the words of the noble Lord Etherton, this is not a small boats bill. The provisions of this bill would affect all who seek refugee status in this country. It is a comprehensive anti-refugee bill. And finally, the noble Lord Forsyth of Drumleen, who unfortunately is not in his place, quoted John Stuart Mill: "Bad men need do nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing." That, I think, is a very useful reflection on the amendment to this motion, the bid by the Liberal Democrats, which has wholehearted Greens backing, to stop this bill now, today, in its tracks. We've heard all the usual reasons, the excuses why we shouldn't. We're only a house of review. We're only an unelected house. Well, I'm going to repeat a question that I put to Part 4 of what's now the Police Act, the part that explicitly targets Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people. A direct question to those planning on voting against the amendment or abstaining on stopping this bill. Is there nothing you would stop? Where do you draw the line? Surely you have a line.
My lords, as other speakers have said, we are now living in an age of mass migration. And as Lord Haig often says, the population of Africa and the Middle East is expected to increase by about 1 million people by the middle of this century. Of course, this country has benefited over the centuries from immigration. But this is now an increasingly crowded island, with all that means for our already hard-pressed housing and public services. For many years, debate on this subject has often conflated economic migrants with genuine asylum seekers, which is why it's absolutely right that this bill distinguishes legal from illegal migration. This very difficult issue is not one faced only by this country, as many of you know. You only have to look at Italy, Greece, France and Germany to see that. And our recent agreements with France and Algeria reflect an important recognition of that reality. The government recognises that the current asylum system isn't working. As you've heard, there's a backlog of 160,000 cases. More than £2 billion a year is being spent on accommodation. And apparently there are more than 80,000 people who've illegally entered the UK since 2018, having often travelled through multiple safe countries to reach the UK, our so-called pull factor. So I welcome this bill, as do a majority of our citizens. It's the government's genuine attempt to remedy our current broken system. Today, we have heard from various sections of this House plenty of outrage, but very little by way of alternative workable solutions to this admittedly very difficult problem. As an earlier speaker said, it's about deterrence, to cut off demand from the organised criminal gangs gaming and profiteering from our current system, and I agree with that. No doubt this bill can be improved here, but it should not be mauled unrecognisably. That would not be understood or accepted, in my view, by a majority of our citizens.
There's little in this bill that I can agree with, other than the broad premise that we must control the dangerous channel crossings and end the business model of the people smugglers. But the term, stop the boats, does not accurately reflect the wide-ranging impact of this bill on asylum seekers and refugees by whichever mode of entry to the UK. It is a hugely complex issue, and it would be good to hear from the Home Office what strategy they are building to identify true need from those just wishing to take advantage of the system, and what efforts are being made to establishing safe and legal routes. The current backlog in processing those already here and the cost to the taxpayer is clearly not acceptable, and it requires resource and efficiency on the part of the Home Office to clear. But if we seek to close our borders to those fleeing persecution without even allowing them a hearing, then what we are saying is that we are outside the principles of international cooperation on which the global refugee system is based. We are in danger of criminalising, incarcerating, forcing statelessness, homelessness and destitution on genuine asylum seekers, many of whom are already traumatised on arrival. There are 34 million refugees and asylum seekers in the world today, with millions more internally displaced. The vast majority are being hosted by those countries which border the conflict areas. I have seen the Rohingya refugee camps at Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. I have seen the vast refugee container camps in Gaziantep on the Turkish-Syrian border, and the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, a country already hosting Palestinian refugees for many decades. It is international cooperation which is key to solving one of the biggest issues that the world is facing, the mass movement of people due to conflict, but also because of climate change. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has categorically stated that if the illegal migration bill is enacted in its current form, it would break the UK's obligations under the Refugee Convention and would significantly undermine the international refugee protection system, which needs support by all members. We cannot just throw up our hands and opt out of a system that we were front and centre in helping shape because things have become difficult. Our international reputation must be preserved because respect from and collaboration with the international community is paramount for the future success of Britain. We have always prided ourselves on our sense of fairness and capacity to protect those in need. And I would hope that we would wish to leave this good reputation for future generations. Our belief in the moral imperative to be open in minds, hearts, and actions. My Lords, the Children's Commissioner, who has a statutory duty to protect the rights of children in England, including those who have arrived in the country fleeing from war and persecution, has stated that the bill undermines other legislation, as in the Children's Act of 1989. I would say to my noble friend the Minister, let's not forget that it was a Conservative-led government under David Cameron which ended child detention and which quadruple locked it into legislation in the 2014 Immigration Act. The safeguards and protections under that legislation are being removed under this bill. The oft-held belief that many claiming to be children are over the age of 18 and thus adults is flawed, as last year alone 850 children were wrongly assessed as adults and sent to adult accommodation and detention centres, which put them directly in harm's way. The Refugee and Migrants Children's Consortium says of this bill, the proposals will leave children locked out of claiming refugee protection, detained, removed, if unaccompanied, accommodated by the Home Office outside the established care system, if a victim of trafficking or child of such a victim unprotected, and denied their citizenship rights. Children will be left in limbo for years, unable to access any form of status or to rebuild their lives. And I would add, with the very real threat of being deported to Rwanda when they reach the age of 18. These most vulnerable young people are affected at a time in their life where there are deep and lasting consequences. Similarly, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, enacted under another Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, is also being compromised in this bill. My Lords, I would also like to add that some of the language used in the other place whilst debating this bill has been deeply unhelpful. In fact, I am dismayed at the narrative that the Home Office has adopted, stigmatising and stereotyping people wherever they come from and under whichever circumstances will do little to advance our aim to manage this most difficult issue. We all wish to see prosperity and security for our country, but I hope with our principles and values intact. We must be on the right side of doing the right thing. The disquiet, this discomfort so many of us feel, whether we can adequately articulate or not, is indicated in how many of us are participating in second reading of this bill. I hope that my noble friend the Minister will take note.
My Lords, the more I listen to this debate, and particularly to my noble friend Lord Carlisle of Berriew, the more strongly I'm convinced that this bill is morally questionable, legally doubtful, and totally unworkable. But setting to one side these wider challenges of the bill, I would like to focus attention on the impact the bill would have on minors, whether accompanied or not. As we have heard, particularly from Lord Howarth of Newport, the bill proposes that these children, if not immediately deported, may be accommodated by the Home Office outside the established care system. Upon reaching the age of 18, they will be deported to a third country with which they most likely have no existing ties and will face a lifetime ban from entering Britain. Accompanied children who are not given the right to remain will also be barred from the UK for life. Despite this disproportionate punishment for the children, I don't believe it would even act as a deterrent. And the noble minister said that the purpose of the bill is supposed to be a deterrent. Because people desperate enough to take to the boats are not going to be put off by a punishment that could be enacted many years into the future. To quote the Refugee and Migrant Children's Association, the bill also undoes a decade's worth of progress made under the Conservative government, reversing the ending of child detention and protections for child victims of trafficking. Lord Forsyth of Drumleen complained that no one is providing solutions, but neither is this bill a solution. This is not going to solve the migration crisis. This is just going to add to the massive backlog of cases waiting to be processed. I too agree with my noble friend, Lord Kerr of Kinlochard, that the solution can be found in centres in France. As we all know, there is a growing illegal migration crisis. We all know that something needs to be done about it. But to attempt a solution that penalises children is misguided in the extreme. This is not how a civilised society treats the most vulnerable.
My Lords, as always in your Lordship's House, it's a great pleasure to be part of a debate which, no matter which side one stands on the issue, marks the breadth of expertise and opinion in this chamber. It's an expertise I respect, and also respect for the strength of feeling on the bill from all sides. That strength of feeling is because the House does reflect the public debate that is taking place outside of Parliament. I'm speaking in support of the progress of this bill, not because I take some pleasure in ever more stringent asylum policy, but, and to perhaps answer the noble Lord Purvis, I want to secure safe and legal routes based on a humanitarian need, and that provides a moral imperative for this bill to succeed and be improved. My Lords, public policy must always rely on a contract and consent with and from the British people. Without that consent, government is powerless. Government should be able to articulate the values of this country in welcoming humanitarian refugees in a constant, evolving policy based on humanitarian need. At the moment, my Lords, this country's asylum policy is in a state of stasis, or at best, a reactive state. A reactive policy that requires a public response before government will act. A totemic tragedy, such as a shock when the washed-up body of the 2-year-old Alan Kurdi galvanised the government to institute a resettlement policy of 20,000 Syrians. Likewise, the Ukrainian and Hong Kong resettlement schemes, of which we are all proud, have all been implemented fully because of public consent and reaction. Meanwhile, the Afghan scheme for resettlement, which seems so important to everyone in August 2021, seems to have stalled quite dramatically in its initial aims. This start-stop policy of bespoke schemes, my Lords, does not represent the values or implementation of a truly humanitarian policy blind to race or geopolitics. Why, my Lords, do we think that our policy has fallen into this stop-start approach to asylum and away from universal legal routes? The first reason has to be the failure of our asylum bureaucracy and lack of resource to process claims. The Prime Minister is prioritising that process with extra staff and support, and that has to be welcomed. Backlogs not only create needless anxiety for those seeking asylum, but also destroy public confidence in the system. That public confidence is, I'm afraid, why this legislation is required. From 300 asylum seekers arriving in small boats in 2018, we've now reached 45,000. The toxin of this seeming lack of control and unfairness then denigrates all asylum seekers across the world. For those of us who want to ensure safe legal routes based on humanitarian need, it is very difficult to find the public consent necessary to permeate public policy beyond the bespoke schemes I've already spoken about. Before 2018, there was an opening after the success of the Syrian resettlement scheme for wider schemes in conjunction with the UNHCR, but that discussion and debate has been paralysed by illegal crossings pushed by the malevolent people traffickers. So, my lords, I accept the government must make every effort to stop the boats if we are to see an expansion of the legal routes and a humanitarian basis that the vast majority of us in your Lordship's House would want to see. If we do not use all legislative tools at our disposal and rebuild public confidence, I don't believe any government, Conservative, Labour, or even a Labour-Lib Dem amalgam, will be able to fully implement a humanitarian legal route process with public consent. And it is this legal route process that I hope my noble friend the Minister will be able to put further flesh on the bones to maximise support in this House. As well as the survey of accommodation of local authorities to identify its cap, I would ask that the Government give further commitments to work with the UNHCR and that work forms part of the regular statement the Home Secretary lays before Parliament. I want to hear, as we progress this bill, a commitment given that there will be identified routes to offer asylum to humanitarian asylum seekers wherever they come from in the world. Transparency in a new process will provide the sunshine and hygiene required to build public confidence and rebuild pride in our humanitarian policy in this country. That is not to say in the future, my lords, that there will not need to be bespoke policies responding to crisis across the world, but they cannot be the basis for our asylum policy. There are always going to be vulnerable people who will not have the media focus required to launch a bespoke scheme in this country. There must be a credible answer to the question Tim Lawton MP asked the Home Secretary at the Home Affairs Select Committee on the routes for those out with, to use a good Scottish word, out with the bespoke schemes. The Government will have to provide further assurance to get more support in your Lordship's House. My Lords, this bill is sadly necessary if we are to help the most vulnerable across the world. I will not be able to support the noble Lord Paddick's fatal motion later. If it were to be successful, I fear that the very people that need us to act for them would see the safe and legal routes at scale required becoming an ever more distant prospect.
My Lords, it's a bit much to be lectured on what is constitutional and what's not constitutional when this bill, like so many other recent bills, impinges on what ought to be the rights and duties of devolved administrations. It's further evidence that the UK Government would happily undo the arrangement of the past 20+ years and reduce or remove the powers of the other parliaments. They might not be quite as ready as the noble Lord Frost, who's not in his place at this point, when he wrote recently on devolution that it was time to stop. His criticism was that the electors in Wales and Scotland kept voting for the wrong parties. The spur towards devolution was, of course, the fact that for many years Scotland and Wales rejected the Conservative Party but had no way of mitigating the impact of Westminster legislation until the referendums in 1997. The difference between the Welsh and Scottish governments and the UK government has never been as stark as in their approach to people seeking sanctuary through asylum and immigration. On this issue, the Conservative Party has no support outside or out with its own ranks, and even many of them must be mortally embarrassed. The rights established by the European Convention on Human Rights are written into Scotland's devolution settlement and have been fundamental to the work of the Scottish Parliament over 20 years. The Convention's incorporation provides fundamental safeguards that ensure that in Scotland, executive powers can't be abused. Scottish ministers cannot act in a way that's incompatible with the Convention, and all its legislation must be compatible. I think in this chamber there is a clear consensus that the bill will breach the Convention and leave the Scottish Parliament in an invidious position under international law. Those involved in human rights in Scotland have described the bill as creating an urgent human rights emergency, and the Scottish Refugee Council condemns it as morally repugnant, practically unworkable, and that it will have severe impacts on women, men and children seeking safety. Just Right Scotland describes the bill as cruel, unnecessary and unlawful, and that this bill condemns people to living a life of limbo and strips them of all support. The government's delegated power memorandum makes it clear that the functions of local authority in respect of looked after children are a devolved matter. This is recognised in clauses 15 to 18, which state that they only apply in England, but there is a very real threat contained in clause 19, which states that the Secretary of State may make regulations in the future on clauses 15 to 18 to apply in the devolved administrations using secondary legislation again. Clauses 23 and 24 of the bill remove duties and powers that currently oblige the devolved administrations to provide support and assistance to victims of trafficking and their families, including children. Instead, it will attempt to compel devolved nations to violate the duties set out in international law. This is contrary to Scottish legislation set out in the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act of 2015. In almost all other countries, this bill could not be tabled as it breaches treaty obligations and is contrary to basic human rights. If the UK had such a thing as a written constitution, this would be unacceptable. If the powers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland were protected, this would not be allowed to happen. Under this government, we're experiencing endless bills that contravene natural justice and encroach on devolved powers. At some point, we have to say, this must stop. This bill should be where we draw the line and say, not in our name.
My Lords, one of the advantages of speaking relatively late on in a debate such as this is it affords one the opportunity to hear so many contributions from your Lordships and the passionate positions that many of you quite understandably have. But I would say that actually, on the whole, this debate has been conducted in a very even-handed way, and I congratulate my noble friend, the Minister, for setting the tone right at the outset of this. A debate such as this was always going to be emotional and controversial, and I think on that, at least, we can all agree. My Lords, I looked at the fatal amendment tabled by the noble Lord Paddick, and I will not be supporting it, although I think it includes some interesting points, because I believe that this bill, the proper place for this bill, is now to go to committee, where the bill can be properly scrutinised and, where necessary, improved. And I totally agree with the noble Lord Coker, who said that your Lordship should not be cowed or intimidated by the other place. It is surely our role to do exactly what we're about to do. Otherwise, it seems to me we have no point at all. And I don't think we need ChatGPT to tell us that. That having been said, I entirely concur with the view of my noble friend Lord Sherburn, who pointed out that this bill, with amendments, has already gone through the other place, and it is a key part of the government's policy to stop the boats, and we should bear that in mind as we go into committee. The noble Lord Lord Dubbs, who is in his place, spoke about one of the points that Lord Paddick had in his fatal amendment, point 4, about a failure to include the measures to eliminate the backlog of asylum cases. And I would just like to press my noble friend, the Minister, on this, because it seems to me that this is one of the worst problems that we have confronting us today. It's a stain on our national character, our inability to process those who are already here, leaving many of them in a kind of a no man's land, waiting for their future to be decided in conditions that, frankly, in some places are deplorable. So is it because of the legal challenges which are mounted each and every time a case comes up? And if so, how will this bill change that? Or is it the incompetence of those who are tasked with processing this? Or is it of lack of resources? And if it's a lack of resources, can the Minister commit to committing more resources? Because it seems to me that a part of any bill should address those that are already here. Another point Lord Paddick made on point 5 was the failure to include measures to tackle people smuggling gangs. Well, the whole idea of this bill is that there will be no need for people smuggling gangs if we can get it out there that once you come here illegally, you will not be able to come here again. But we need to make sure that message goes out loud and clear. I remember the human trafficking bill, the Foreign Office was tasked all around the world with having endless campaigns of bringing this to the public's attention in the locality where the Foreign Office was based. They should be tasked once more again, once this bill becomes law, which I believe it will do, in actually pointing the new legislation out all around the world, that if people come here illegally, they will not be able to stay here. The Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, reminded us of the huge increase in displaced people, many millions more, anticipated by 2050, as a result of climate change or conflict. And we're seeing today what's happening in the Sudan. And if we believe that climate change is going to get worse, whole swathes of sub-Saharan Africa will become uninhabitable. And we talk about the difference between internally displaced people and displaced people. Well, I would submit if you can't actually live somewhere, soon those internally displaced people will have to seek their lives elsewhere. That's going to have huge migratory pressures. So the result of all this, it is incumbent on us to have a fair and enforceable migration policy. And frankly, my lords, nothing I've heard this afternoon, or indeed since we started this debate, suggests to me that any of those who've been criticising this bill have come up with a credible, workable alternative. See, we are left, my lords, with a policy which is neither fair to those already here or those seeking to come here through legal channels. This is manifestly not fair to anyone. And I would just point out, finally, on the subject of Rwanda, and the Greens seem to have something against Rwanda. Well, those of us who went to Rwanda for CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting there last year, saw a very different country, I believe, to that which is being depicted by some whose knowledge of the country is perhaps a little bit second-hand or out of date. It's known as the Switzerland of Africa, and I believe that it's a well-placed country to receive asylum seekers. What I would just say to my honourable friend, the Minister, is I'd just like to tease out of him a little bit more about the deal with Rwanda and what discussions the government have had with the government in Rwanda about the guaranteed freedom of people who we are sending there, and also the ability of those people, once they are there, to return to their own homelands if that is what they seek to do. My lords, I shall not detain you much longer, but I would just end by saying this. For too long, as a country, as a government, as successive governments, we have shirked our responsibilities by failing to enact a fair and enforceable policy on asylum and migration. And difficult and controversial, although aspects of this bill most certainly are, I do believe it is a positive move to redress this. I therefore welcome this bill, which I will be supporting. And my lords, if not this, then what?
My lords, can I begin by saying that I also fully support this bill. I think it's a necessary bill, and I'd like to also begin by thanking Unison and the RMT two trade unions for their briefing. I've noticed over the years how the Labour Party no longer seems to mention unions. Possibly they're a bit embarrassed. They might win the next election and then God knows what they do with this bill, because I've noticed this week they have been backpedalling a bit on what they might do with legislation that our government is passing. But the other thing that struck me about this debate is so much of it has been about refugees and not much about the people who actually live in Britain. Now, they're not racist and they don't dislike people, but the fact of the matter is that this is a matter of democracy. And the people of Britain are fed up to the back teeth with a government that doesn't appear to be able to control the boats. It's as simple as that. They're not against legal migration or legal immigration, but they fail to understand how we can have a government that can't manage to stop a dinghy in the middle of a bit of sea. So this, in many ways, is a matter of democracy and it's a matter of fairness to many people. The people who've welcomed the refugees from the Ukraine and Afghanistan are welcoming them because they're seen as legitimate refugees. These people are not. And we've heard a lot about international obligations. Well, we had an international obligation to the European Union. The people revolted against it. There are all sorts of international obligations. NATO, the Council of Europe, the United Nations. And while we're at it, could I just remind members that Churchill, who is always quoted for the Council of Europe, was basically pretty disinterested in it. All of the work on the Council of Europe was done by Ernie Bevin, the Labour Foreign Secretary. Churchill showed virtually no interest in the Council of Europe, but he did admittedly read a couple of speeches which I doubt he understood. So let's get away from this idea that somehow Churchill and Maxwell Fyfe were the great godfathers of international cooperation that can't be broken. As time moves on, and let me remind you, the refugee system set up in the late 1940s was to deal with the forcible removal of German background citizens from Poland and Czechoslovakia. It was nothing to do with migration from Africa or anywhere else like that. I, in my earlier years in this House, sat on the Foreign Affairs Committee till the whips decided to get rid of me. One of the things we looked at was Operation Sophia, which was the EU operation on migrants. And the subcommittee made the title of our report, Operation Sophia, a failed operation, because we found that we couldn't control the boats in the Mediterranean. And my main worry about this particular bill is not that it's too stringent or something, but that it won't work. And the key to making it work is somehow the government has got to find a way of stopping the boats. It's as simple as that. If you don't get across the channel, you won't try and get across the channel. But if you're told you're going to be waiting for 10 years before you'll be deported, of course you'll come across the channel, because you'll think, oh, well, there'll be a couple more government changes before then, and they'll probably get fed up and they'll run out of money and we'll all be allowed to stay. So the key to this, Minister, is you've got to work out a way of stopping the boats. Now, unlike Australia, we don't have a nearby island where we can put people on. You could try out Ascension Island, but I don't think there's anything much closer than that. So what I would say is that you have to make it clear that there is no future in landing in the UK. And the point I want to make on the two unions I mentioned is that we must make it clear in this legislation that it is not going to give powers to anyone to ask social care workers, unison workers or railway workers to perform illegal acts. They cannot be subject to being asked to do things which are in any way dubious, and I hope that it will be written in that there will be an indemnity for them if they are. So, in closing, I'm pleased to support this Act. I hope it works, but the key is to stop the boats crossing the channel.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the wisdom of my noble friend Lord Balfe. My Lords, defence of the realm is the first duty of government, so this bill is essential if unpalatable. Without control over our own borders, Parliament, lawmaking and evidence-based policy become sideshows. It's not dehumanising for our government to strain every sinew to stop the boats. We don't want anyone else dying in a flimsy boat in our waters. This trade is doing untold harm to our country, as well as to those putting family fortunes and precious lives into the hands of people smugglers. What is being traded is not simply money for unsafe passage, it's also our physical and social infrastructure. Many speaking against today's bill habitually and rightly hold this government to account for lack of housing and access to essential services, particularly children's social care, but also family doctors, education, and everything else our people rely on for quality of life. And here, may I ask my noble friend the Minister, can he provide any detail as to the current strain on children's social services, and are there any projections of how this could worsen without action? One of the first rules of economics is wants are unlimited, but resources to satisfy them are limited. The basic instinct of many here is to scoop up the dispossessed, especially vulnerable children, and give them the benefits of living in Britain. However, whilst we might want to do that, we need to pay attention to the electorate. It is not pandering to ask what people who voted for this government want ministers to prioritise. And over 2/5 said their second greatest concern about the cost of living, after the cost of living, is illegal migration routes such as small boats, more than those who said NHS waiting lists. We're heading in the right direction in an incredibly difficult area of social policy, but we cannot be half-hearted. The small boats business model is ruthlessly pursued. Therefore, this bill must not be so watered down that the loopholes are big enough to drive an armada through. The electorate are not closet Little Englanders, and I choose my words carefully. Scotland has taken a disproportionately low number of asylum seekers. England has stepped up to accept most of those entering through safe and legal global routes on which we have a proud recent record. We're certainly not ducking out of the United Nations Refugee Convention and the UK's international responsibilities. As we've heard, our country-specific routes have provided refuge for 150,000 people from Hong Kong, 160,000 Ukrainians, 25,000 Afghans forced to flee the Taliban. Another 50,000 people have come to the UK via non-specific country routes, including through the family reunion route for those with a qualifying family member in the UK. Yet 74%, as we've heard, of illegal arrivals are adult males, many of whom who came directly from safe countries such as Albania, and all travelled through safe countries such as France, where they should have claimed asylum. Neither are the electorate heartless, but they are concerned about the £6 million daily costs of housing illegal migrants and other expenses like the manpower needed to deal with them. I'm in and out of prisons, and one reason they find it hard to maintain staffing levels is because Border Force absorbs so many of their trained officers. As mentioned earlier, people are particularly concerned about the already stretched social services backdrop for British children, such as the lack of foster carers and other pressures, which mean many are placed far from home in residential settings. Those who argue that unaccompanied children should automatically become looked after by local authorities and certainly not be sent back need to be wide-eyed about the knock-on effect this is already having. Children who are sent on ahead to benefit from the British system further strain our social care infrastructure and make it even harder to address current failings. Commons amendments mean return only happens if unaccompanied children's country of origin is safe or they are to be reunited with their parents. Putting it bluntly, if parents are not dissuaded from sending their unaccompanied children on these boats, smugglers will likely focus their trade on this new area of weakness. The vast majority of illegal migrants are not pregnant women and children, but that could change if we do anything to provide a magnet to attract them. We cannot tread so timidly as to be ineffectual. Every day, people on the coast are dealing directly with this growing problem of illegal migrants who have to be housed and medically treated, sometimes as a result of their perilous journey. This bill will attract, I'm sure, an abundance of amendments, but these should not be laid cynically to prevent progress on small boats before the next election. We and the electorate need action this day.
Lords, it's good that there's one thing that seems to unite the whole House, and that is the fact that we all deplore the backlog and the need for that to be addressed. And the noble lady Baroness Bennett went on about all the ex-Home Secretaries in the Conservative Party responsible, having gone back much longer. I have to say that during the 13 years of a Labour government, we had exactly the same problem. And I remember very much as a constituency MP, this was one of the huge issues that came up time after time. I will be supporting this bill at its second reading tonight and will be opposing the Wrecking Amendment. I think it is important that the Convention to allow government bills to have second readings are adhered to, no matter how strongly we may feel about the legislation. And of course, we're going to all have the right to amend this bill. I may put down some amendments myself, and we can do what we normally do, which is make those amendments and vote on them. But for me, the principal aim of this legislation is to act to stop the small boats coming here in the first place. Around 18 months ago, I had a 3-hour debate here on migrants, and it was very sadly on the day when 27 lives had just been lost crossing the Channel, and much was said then about how that could never be allowed to happen again. And since then, the numbers coming over on dinghies have escalated. 2021, when I spoke, there'd been something like 28,500 come through already. 2022, there were 45,755, and now, from 2018, we've had nearly 100,000 people arrive at Dover. And I think it is legitimate to say that our country has lost control of our own borders, and certainly that's what the public, when they look at the television pictures, think. We have seen that some of these new arrivals, not many, but some, have been identified as a terrorist threat, and many have disappeared with no idea where we have no idea where they've gone to or what they're up to. And I think the security of our own country must be a priority of government, as so must the social cohesion of our communities. Moving hundreds of mainly young men, and I often think, where are all the young women? Where are all the women? Mainly these hundreds of young men into areas where they will not be able to intermix is a recipe for problems. And the public are not stupid, nor are the vast majority prejudiced against genuine asylum seekers, but they see at first hand the impact on their community and know that it is unsustainable. And when I visited Dover to see for myself how the arrivals were processed some years ago, 2 years ago, we cannot ignore the fact that what happens to these people in France or in many other countries is very, very, how we treat people rather than how they're treated in those countries is far superior to what happens elsewhere. So we cannot ignore that there is a pull factor to the United Kingdom. Otherwise, I don't see why so many want to leave the safe countries that they've come to come here. Of course, there's some with family connections, but we do have a system that operates. Maybe that can be looked at to make it better, but that would allow legal entry for them. But those who manage the boats, the people smugglers, are well acquainted with what happens in our own country. They know there are at least 5 different avenues to challenge a negative asylum claim result. And if all that fails, another asylum claim can be simply lodged in a fresh application. And then we see someone who commits a hideous crime like a murder here and is being deported. One of the many agencies will assemble a mass of MPs and probably noble lords to stop the deportation, and all usually paid for by public money and legal aid. And we cannot go on with people being allowed to bring multiple claims and judicial reviews. It's a lawyer's paradise, but it's the hard-working British taxpayer bearing the cost. So making it clear, as this bill does, that if you come here illegally, then you will not be considered for asylum, will be a deterrent, and that you will be deported. And I want to see the commitment given by the Home Secretary that once the small boats have been stopped, the government will look at more safe and legal routes for general asylum seekers. I want that to happen, and we will keep an eye to make sure it does. But we really do need to differentiate between economic migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. And even if some people in this House do not differentiate, the public differentiates, and that is what's important. And I think it's also very important that when people complained about the language used by some ministers, I think sometimes the language used by people who are supporting this bill or make some quite rational, sensible points that are then kind of almost portrayed as being racist. I think we have to be careful about our language just as much. In my view, the reality is that only tough and unambiguous legislation will stand any chance of succeeding in dissuading people from risking their lives by jumping into dinghies and heading for Britain in the expectation that once here they will be permitted to stay. We have to send a signal that we are not an open door and that we will not continue to allow the industry of lawyers making millions from the whole asylum system to continue. The government is unwise, I think, to seek to give the impression that the bill will solve all our illegal immigration problems. It won't, but it certainly is a start, and we have to try. And this bill is now with us, and will, with some improvements, it should be supported.
My Lords, stop the boats is actually a worthy aim. And the Prime Minister is right to consider it a priority of government, but this bill, as currently written, will not achieve that aim. Let me assure my noble friends straight away that although I have great concerns about this text, I will not be opposing second reading today. My concerns are numerous, and my probing and questions require some clear answers from my noble friend. My remarks are made partly from my background as an immigration minister in the UK, partly as a former spokesperson in the European Parliament, and partly as a lawyer, not a lefty lawyer. I begin by telling my noble friend that the ways chosen by the government to alleviate the undoubted suffering of persecuted people fleeing tyranny will actually have the opposite outcomes to those suggested, and in implementation will both break solemn laws and treaties and provide greater sustenance to the real criminals, the people traffickers and smugglers who should be our first targets. The number of detected human trafficking offences has increased substantially in recent years. We must not allow them to profit from vulnerable people. Why are we not doing more to catch these real criminals, some of whom are actually here in the UK? As a lawyer, my noble friend must understand that I will never vote in favour of our government breaking the law, and I trust that is the same situation for him. The government has claimed that it has taken advice from the finest legal minds in this country. Can he please name these fine legal minds? And to clarify, I am satisfied, as is the UNHCR and other organisations, that no asylum seeker per se can be illegal. There is a clear difference, as my noble friend ought to know, between migrants who come here illicitly or deceitfully and are in breach of our tight immigration rules, and asylum seekers who present here and claim asylum under the criteria, the strict criteria of the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. In the first case, those that break our immigration rules should and must be deported speedily. In the second case, applications for asylum should be quickly put to proof that they meet the fundamental criteria to be granted refuge. If they cannot, they then should be returned to whence they came. When I was minister in 1996, I committed extra resources to the removal process because I believed our system must be seen by our people as firm but fair. We had to sometimes apply pressure on foreign governments to achieve that. Those that succeeded in complying or proving their status were afforded the traditional and vital hospitality that this country is, until now, noted for. The government is instead trying to recategorise asylum seekers as themselves being criminals before their cases are even heard. They are using rhetoric which is extreme, and in implementing their Rwandan scheme, flagrantly ignoring laws. Not only the 1951 Refugee Convention, but also other international agreements, and of course the European Convention on Human Rights. Regarding the Rwanda scheme, the bill sets out to diminish the UK court's powers to suspend deportation and sets a dangerous precedent about the way in which it looks at judicial review. Can my noble friend really defend this behaviour as a lawyer? And when he replies, can he please give us the precise details of that part of the agreement that obliges the UK to take Rwandan asylum seekers back here? May I refer him to section 16 of the Memorandum of Understanding. Changes to the bill were made in the House of Commons. Some were made in deference to extreme demands. One was also made relating to the issue of safe and legal routes to this country for asylum seekers. We're all aware of those routes which come from UN programmes. Indeed, I was the minister responsible for that from Bosnia in 1996. We're also aware of special UK programmes from favoured countries. But noting the wish of the government to have an annual limit on such arrivals, how can my noble friend describe what new arrangements might look like? The concession in the Commons does not really give us much to go on. All UK embassies and consulates, in my view, should be a potential application post for entry where processing can take place. That is the least we should accept. Of course, the Foreign Office maintains a list of safe countries, and I accept that it will be more difficult for those from such countries to meet the criteria for asylum, but the opportunities for applicants must be spread across our presence wherever in the world it might be. We need to increase our resources to deal with cases quickly, but let's go back finally to the Channel and the boats. I was a drafter of the Dublin agreements when we were in the EU. They at least made it easier to send back asylum seekers within the law. Since we left the EU, we must rely on bilaterals with our neighbours, and I welcome our discussions with the French, but these need to go further with goodwill on both sides. Breaking international law, my lords, will certainly not help. Also, we need to become reassociated with new EU initiatives to handle the large number of migrants who try to enter the Schengen area every year. Together, we have a better chance of achieving it. My lords, there are various ways in which we can bring about change to protect lives and our borders at the same time, but that does not include breaking international law, leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, curtailing the powers of the UK courts, criminalising innocent victims, and harming, as a result, our race and community relations in the UK, which a lot of us have worked so hard over many years to improve.
My Lords, I'm delighted to follow the speech of Lord Kirkhope, who was one of the best speeches I think we've had in this debate, and made it very clear why this is a bad piece of legislation.
Yes, hear, hear. Across
Europe, we live in times in which feelings that so many of us had thought outdated now appear to be re-emerging and spreading. Pope Francis spoke those words when he reflected on the rising tide of intolerance on our continent.
He went on to talk about the feelings of suspicion, fear, contempt, and even hatred towards individuals or groups who are judged to be different based on their ethnicity, nationality, or religion. My lords, Britain will face a state of moral decline if bigotry, intolerance, and hatred feel at home in our country. Intolerance of people because they are different will dehumanize our society. Recently, we have seen some politicians stoking up intolerance of refugees and migrants. But the Britain of my lifetime has been a beacon of freedom, tolerance, and justice, and that's how I want it to remain. British people actively built links across communities, challenging hatred, welcoming refugees, and standing up for those who are victimized. And I believe we see no greater evidence of this harmony, tolerance, and community than the scenes we have witnessed across the country these last few days, following the coronation of the King and Queen. It's a privilege to sit in this place, but with that privilege goes a duty not to allow vile ideas to grow and spread without challenge. The great social reformer, Leo Absey MP, who was a dear friend, once said, "Tolerate everyone, tolerate everything, just never tolerate the intolerant." My lords, I believe we must seek to resolve the issues of migrants crossing the channel in small boats, and several of us from this House and the other House raised these matters when we met French parliamentarians in July, and we urged them to press their government to work with our government to end a common approach to see what we can do. But I very much regret that this piece of populist legislation is no answer and will solve nothing. Rather, it will stoke up ill feeling towards some of the most vulnerable and desperate people on the planet, refugees, all for a short-term gain. And I would ask the architects of this bill to do one thing. Heed the words of the Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who said, "History will judge harshly those who sacrifice tomorrow for today." My especial concern about this bill is the awful impact it will have upon unaccompanied migrant children. These refugee children not only have need of our protection, but they are also entitled to it because we have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Yet across our continent, the health and well-being of unaccompanied refugee children is being compromised, as I well know from a report that I did when I was a member of the Council of Europe. Thousands of refugee youngsters are suffering. They're being abused, they're being trafficked, they're self-harming, and there's plenty of evidence some are taking their own lives. We must challenge those using toxic rhetoric about migration and displaying intolerance and prejudice which violates basic human rights. Political point scoring about refugees, most especially refugee migrant children, should not be allowed to deny these children the help that they need. We should all be concerned about this bill because the government does not have a good record in dealing with unaccompanied migrant children. Some 4,500 unaccompanied migrant children, some as young as 10, have been placed in hotels. 200 have gone missing and have not been seen again. Section 20 of the Children Act 1989 give local councils alone, the authority, the statutory authority of child protection, giving them powers which includes caring for unaccompanied migrant children. It does not give these powers to the Home Office. My lords, there appears to be no legal basis for placing unaccompanied children in homes, in hotels operated by the Home Office. Now, I've twice attempted to discover which Act of Parliament has allowed the government to do this. I asked the Minister this last week. It's a simple question. I ask again. Which Act of Parliament allows the government to put these children in hotels? This bill will make the plight of unaccompanied migrant children even worse, denying them the right to claim refuge protection. It will make provision for them to be detained. And, despite being youngsters, unaccompanied by an adult, it will allow for them to be removed from this country. My lords, is the United Kingdom seriously going to deport traumatised, in need and unprotected children? If we do, shame, shame, shame on us.
My lords, there is a legitimate debate to be had about how the UK manages its borders. And like every other noble peer in here, I have opinions on that too. However, but it should, I think, exclude those who are already subjected to the abuse through the heinous crime of modern slavery. The former Prime Minister said in the other place that it has always been important to separate modern slavery from immigration status. Regrettably, this bill brings modern slavery into the heart of the immigration debate through clauses 21 to 28 and is using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. My Lords, the UK has had a proud record of seeking to protect victims, prevent modern slavery and prosecute traffickers. The 3 Ps is based on the UN Palermo Protocol. I am pleased to say that the bill I introduced in 2013 in Northern Ireland, which passed in 2015, has played its part. It is therefore with great sadness and dismay that I contemplate the outcome of this bill on victims across the United Kingdom and in Northern Ireland particularly. This bill does not measure up to the 3 Ps. We are not protecting victims, which we cannot prosecute, and the perpetrators of these crimes, without which we cannot prevent exploitation. The modern slavery strategies of the devolved nations will go up in smoke without any consultation, and the ability to care for victims under devolved legislation is undermined by this bill. The Minister may say that these measures are necessary to prevent abuse. We heard that last year in the debate on Part 5 of the Nationality and Borders Act, which came into effect only at the end of January. Since then, we know that the number of victims who have received reasonable grounds decision has plummeted. In the last quarter, where the Home Office's new guidance applied for 2 out of the 3 months, only 49% of adults received a positive reasonable grounds decision, compared to 87% in 2022. I expect the Minister might say, in summing up, the number of people who are referred into the NRM from immigration detention. The Noble Lord the Minister, in response to a PQ tabled by the Noble Lord McCall, argued that it was individuals arriving by small boats who are referred from detention who are abusing the system. My Lords, no one self-refers into the NRM. It is first responders who refer based on evidence of exploitation. Of course, we do not want people abusing the system. However, the number of people who are referred from detention are small relative both to the number of people who come across the channel and to the number referred into the NRM. And the Home Office admits that the number of decision makers has not kept up with referrals, leading to long delays in decision making. All of this leads me to conclude that clauses 21 to 28 are disproportionate and will negatively impact genuine victims. I hope the Noble Lord the Minister will update the House on how many referrals there have been from detention in the first quarter after the NBA reforms. Finally, my Lords, I want to come back to Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission are of the view that the EU Trafficking Directive rights still apply to victims of Northern Ireland under the protocol. While the government have argued wrongly, in my opinion, that they can deprive victims of support on public order grounds under the European Convention against Human Trafficking in Northern Ireland, victims have another recourse, Article 11 of the Trafficking Directive. I hope the Noble Lords, the Minister, will address this issue as he sets out the impact of this bill for victims in the devolved administrations.
My Lords, it is no easy matter to follow so many of your Lordships who have raised some difficult and problematic questions about this bill. Can it, as it aims, prevent and deter migration, particularly by safe and illegal routes? Does it comply with UK law and international law? Some noble lords have raised interesting questions in supporting Lord Paddick in wanting to see it gone. I agree this is a tough and apparently uncompromising measure. Not only does it oblige the Home Secretary to detain and remove those arriving in breach of immigration control, it prohibits a challenge on human rights
or asylum-seeking grounds, disapplies some modern-day slavery protections, and bans those subject to Clause 2 from gaining immigration or citizenship status in future. It also seeks, as your lordships have pointed out, to avoid the prospect of our own courts or the European Court of Human Rights at Strasbourg holding up removal. But it is necessary and proportionate on a number of grounds: the functioning of our democracy under the rule of law, laws made in Westminster, to take account of the changed circumstances since the 1950s and the new character of immigration into Europe in general, and for the effective working of the asylum system, as so many of your lords wish. Our laws are made in Parliament, our judges apply them and when necessary interpret them, but ultimately Parliament, not the judiciary, must legislate. It does so on the authority of the people who vote and choose a government with a particular mandate. The voters have made clear on a number of occasions that they want the borders controlled, and the House of Commons on this bill has given strong backing with a majority, as has been said already, of around 60 in most divisions. It is not, and I follow some noble lords in saying this, it is not, in my view, for this chamber to reverse the direction of policy backed by voters, the government and the MPs, but of course there will be room to improve the measure. My lords, circumstances and costs have changed significantly since the pioneering agreements about which you have spoken so illuminatingly. Not only has international travel risen to mass proportions, but the costs of immigration have also risen, far beyond what could have imagined in those pioneering days when Parliament first debated Beveridge's blueprint for the welfare state. Then, in 1943, the premise was that benefit and the benefit system would depend on individual contribution. Each individual paid a contribution and benefit was linked to it, although there was discretionary provision for exceptional assistance. By 1951, the year of the convention, potential deviation from the contributory principle, even over such a thing as a qualifying period for old age pension, was a most serious matter of debate. Today, the system is significantly different. It's more expensive and it's far more reliant on tax funding, with higher expectations for social security, healthcare and education. As families struggle to pay the bills, it is right to tackle the rising costs of illegal migration, which we are all paying through an increased tax base for that and other things. And I needn't remind your lordships that the UK is now at its almost highest tax extraction, I would say, since the Second World War. And this problem is not a UK problem alone. The small boats may be, but not the general problem of people wanting to settle in Western European countries. Already, as has been mentioned, Rule 39 of the European Court rules are being reconsidered and reviewed with representations from a number of member states. I'm afraid that though I wish the government well with its transfer arrangements, there is less of an appetite for transfer or return agreements than may have existed 20 years ago. Immigration has moved centre stage in all our neighbouring countries. In France, President Macron's immigration bill is having a not very happy reception from left and right, with demonstrations in the streets. Earlier this month, the Italian foreign minister cancelled a trip to Paris because the French interior minister had said the Italian prime minister was incapable of controlling migration. And that was hardly months after the dust settled on the diversion by Italy of a ship, a humanitarian ship, carrying 300 refugees to France. Those of us who want, and I am one of them, safe and legal asylum system for people fleeing persecution and danger to life, and an immigration system which supports the UK's economic needs, recognise we must manage both effectively. Removing illegal migrants from this country while their applications are processed may sound drastic, but if the alternative is to billet them into local hotels and disused barracks, there is a danger of undermining social cohesion and the rule of law. The laws of this country matter. They are and have for centuries been fair and welcoming to those who flee persecution in their homelands, generous to the many thousands, including myself, who came to this country to take advantage of its unparalleled opportunities. Voters now want their borders controlled. I support this bill because it is necessary to tackle a particular problem, because the UK, like its fellow European countries, must recognise the political imperative, and because it is a duty on those responsible for fiscal and economic affairs to control expenditure. But above all, I support it because the laws which govern this country should protect the liberties of all its people, be fair and proportionate, and have the support of the people in whose name the law is made.
My Lords, if I may. My Lords, one of the few compensations of speaking so late, it does enable me to try and respond to some of the points made in this fascinating but I think worrying debate over the last few hours. And Noble Lord Lawful Forsyth is not here, but I did want to come back to the challenge he raised right at the beginning, which when he said those who are opposed to the bill, are they not concerned about the plight of these poor people coming over at perilous cost, often to their lives, in these small boats, having been exploited by these international criminal gangs? Of course, my lords, we are concerned about those people. But, my lords, whether this bill is the right way to deal with the issue, I have very severe doubts. Now, Noble Lord Forsyth also challenged us to come up with a coherent alternative, which I think, my lords, is somewhat disingenuous, given the scepticism which so many of us have about whether this bill will actually achieve its stated intentions. But I did think, my lords, that the December the 9th debate, the Archbishop, the most... No, it's not. It's the most... Yes, indeed. The most Reverend Primate, the most Reverend Primate, really laid it out, my lords. A rigorous approach to combating smugglers. Why don't we hear more about that from the government? The provision of safe and legal ways for people to get here and to receive assessment and, where appropriate, protection. And, my lords, he argued for an update to the 1951 Refugee Convention to meet modern circumstances. That seems to me international cooperation based on human rights is a much more effective way to develop a plan to deal with these issues. My lords, the second point I really wanted to make is to come back to one made again right at the start by the noble and learned Lord Etherton, who referred to the fact that under immigration rules there is no asylum visa route for an individual refugee to enter the UK and claim asylum. That means that unless a person is within one of the 4 resettlement schemes or asylum is sought by someone already legally present in the UK, the refugee's arrival in and entry to the UK will inevitably be illegal. As he said, this bill is not, therefore, a small boats bill. The provisions of the bill will affect all who seek refugee status in this country and are entitled to the protection of the 1951 Convention. The third point I'd make, my lords, is really to refer to the extraordinary intervention by the Home Secretary this morning in seeking to tell this House what she considers our duty to be. I actually think, my lords, this House is well able to make up its own mind on that. But for me, upholding the rule of law and international law obligations, preventing the unfettered power being given to the Home Secretary in this bill, questioning the retrospective nature of some of the bill's provisions, and seeking to retain the protections contained in the Modern Slavery Act are matters which should weigh rather more heavily in our deliberations than the Home Secretary's crude attempt to distract from her own lamentable performance by indulging in dog-whistle politics of the worst kind. My Lords, my fourth point is really to question the Minister on the government's assertions in relation to modern slavery that the bill is needed to prevent people from gaming the system. The leading modern slavery charity Hestia, who supported over 2,700 victims in London last year, has seen no evidence to suggest the government's modern slavery process is being exploited by individuals seeking asylum in the UK. This is backed up by a number of other modern slavery charities who've written to us over the last few days. And I mean, if you just look at what Nottingham University and Human Trafficking UK have said, the victims of modern slavery may not know they've entered the UK illegally. Traffickers may deliberately withhold information and documentation as a means of control, and may have offered to arrange travel on behalf of those they are planning to exploit. So potential victims therefore may be unaware of their status or need for entry documentation, believing traffickers have arranged this for them. Now, the Minister earlier spoke of the generosity of the British people. A number of noble lords have referred to it. Well, I agree, and I suspect that generosity would extend to wanting to protect the protections that we have in the Modern Slavery Act. Now, rightly, my lords, the government took great credit internationally for the provisions of the 2015 legislation, and I applaud them for it. Now, they are ruining that, throwing it away recklessly, and with it the protections for some of the most vulnerable people. My Lord, if I could just end by commenting on Lord Paddick's amendment, which he spoke to with such force. It's always interesting, I have to say, that Liberal Democrats have always questioned the legitimacy of this chamber. And it's interesting, my Lords, that they seem to have rather changed their minds and feel it's legitimate for us to reject a bill. My Lords, that is not what we do. We have the ability to scrutinise this wretched bill thoroughly, and I hope we will do so.
I apologise to the noble lord for being a little premature. My lords, one of the striking things about this very interesting debate is that noble lords on all sides of the chamber have spoken in many cases as if they were proceeding from a sort of fundamental principle of great importance to them. For some, it was the vision of what our country is. For others, it was a universal principle of humanitarianism. For others, again, it might have been a commitment to internationalism as a means of resolving problems. And there were others, of course. My fundamental starting point is more mundane. It is the international legal principle that no country is obliged to admit foreign nationals. And if they do so, they may impose conditions on that entry. Now, of course, we in this country mitigate that right, our right, to refuse to admit foreign nationals, in ways that we have chosen to do over the past. For example, when we were members of the European Union, we gave free access to the country to citizens of EU member states. Another way in which we have abridged that international right is by entering, of course, into the Refugee Convention. And inevitably, these sorts of arrangements involve some sort of international agreement, and so can be categorized as falling under the heading of international law. I'm not, of course, a lawyer nor making a legal point, but we need, as in my view, to take account, as my just disappeared noble friend Lord Balfe said, of the circumstances in which we entered into those arrangements and whether those circumstances continue to apply. Because we have, in my view, a degree of flexibility about how we apply them in the light of changing circumstances. The circumstances in which we entered the Refugee Convention contemplated broadly the care of often large numbers of people displaced by war and other catastrophes, usually in adjacent countries, and on a temporary basis until they could return safely to their home. How is it, and I think a lot of people would ask this question, how is it that by means of the same convention we are having a debate this evening about transcontinental travel facilitated by profitable travel agencies run as a business? They may be criminal enterprises, but they are profitable travel agencies run as a business, with a view to permanent settlement. This is a very long way indeed from where we started. Now, some people may say, well, of course, the world has changed since we entered the convention, and this is what the world is like now, and we should share our burden. And I fully accept arguments that say that it is right that Britain, as a leading international power, should share burdens. And there are ways in which we can share burdens by doing things for people who are displaced into countries, not necessarily by coming to this country, but helping them in the places where they are displaced. And it could be said that we could do more on that front. We then come, I can't resist saying this, to references to the European Convention on Human Rights. I find it very hard from many noble lords to accept comments about the European Convention on Human Rights when we so lightly pass over the fact that the rights of the people of our own people in Northern Ireland to a say in the laws they live under is abridged by the Northern Ireland Protocol and by the Windsor framework that has followed it. But when it suits us, we're all for the European Convention on Human Rights, but we're willing to blink it when it doesn't. And I think there is a degree of double-sightedness on that, if I may call that. Now, I do have some concerns. It's not all good news for my noble friend on the front bench. I do have some concerns about the bill, in particular the fact, which has been alluded to glancingly by some noble lords, that it deliberately catches some British citizens within its scope. It is possible, in fact, to be a British citizen and still be an illegal migrant under this bill and denied access to British citizenship as a result of being an illegal migrant. And that is because the drafters of the bill, I assume from the Home Office, have, as they have so often in the past, deliberately conflated the two concepts of naturalisation and registration. They have treated them separately in the bill in separate clauses, but they have imposed the same penalties and the same process. And it will not be the first time that I've reminded noble lords that the two things are entirely different. Naturalisation is a concession whereby the British government gives citizenship to people of foreign nationality. Registration, a process I believe introduced by the post-war Labour government, is a process whereby the British state acknowledges an existing right to British citizenship, which has been difficult to establish either through the vagueness of circumstances or the want of proper documentation. It is akin to the sort of blunders we fell into that led to the scandal of the Windrush problem. Now, I do believe that the bill needs to be amended, looked at very carefully, to ensure that those who are entitled to British citizenship by way of registration are not denied those rights because they arrive in the country irregularly. And I'll be coming back, I hope other noble lords will be coming back to this when we reach committee.
My Lords, I declare my interest as an immigrant. As a proud immigrant, this country has given me so many opportunities to build from scratch a consumer brand, Cobra beer, loved by this country, a household name in the UK. To be the youngest university chancellor in this country from 2005 to 2010 of the University of West London. to be the first Indian-born Chancellor for Russell Group University in this country, the third largest university, the University of Birmingham, to join this House as one of its three youngest peers 17 years ago, to be the first Zoroastrian Parsi to sit in the history of this House. And I hail from the smallest minority community in the world, the Zoroastrian Parsis. There are just 100,000 of us in the world, and we fled from Iran, Persia in those days, to escape religious persecution. We went to India, and over the centuries, I'm proud to say that per capita of achievement is probably one of the most successful communities in the world. And that's because good immigration has always worked. The 14% of immigrants in this country contribute so much to make sure that this country, with 1% of the world's population, is still the sixth largest economy in the world. And the immigrants in this country and the children of immigrants are reaching the very top, and no better example than our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. The Noble Lord the Minister started the debate by saying that the purpose of the illegal migration bill is to prevent and deter unlawful migration, and in particular migration by unsafe and illegal routes, by requiring the removal from the UK. And yet, my lords, this bill, as we've heard from so many noble lords today, creates a hostile image of immigration. I would say even more so than Theresa May when she was Home Secretary and then Prime Minister, when she created a hostile approach and image of immigration from 2010 to 2019. For example, in 2012, she removed the 2-year post-graduation work visa for international students, which I spearheaded in 2007-2008, and Boris Johnson brought it back to start again in 2021. This bill is focusing on the boats. This bill is focusing on one of the 5 pledges of the Prime Minister. We all want the boats to stop. That's not the question. It's how we do it that matters. Not in an inhuman way, not in a way that breaches international law, not in a way that breaches international commitments. The Bar Council considers that the bill as currently drafted is incompatible with the principles which underlie the rule of law. Not in a way that removes this country's centuries-old reputation for fairness and justice, which is respected around the world. So this bill is meant to be a deterrent, but let's put this in perspective. The 45,000 people who came across in those boats last year make up less than 10% of the net migration of 500,000 people into this country. And it is a fear of migration that is created. It is a fear that led to David Cameron and Theresa May wanting to bring it down to the tens of thousands. Well, where are we in the tens of thousands? It's 500,000. It's the fear of immigration created, for example, by Angela Merkel when she said she would allow 1 million refugees to settle in Germany in 2015 at the height of the Syrian crisis. And whether we like it or not, that fear played a major part in the Brexit vote turning out the way that it did. And yet look at today. On the 23rd of February this year, a study brought out by King's College London, the UK public have among the most positive attitudes to immigration, according to the study, that ranks the country at the top of an international league table as the most accepting of new arrivals. So where is this will of the people? That's the will of the people. This is the latest study that's come out. And would the Noble Lord the Minister please explain to me, why are international students included in the net migration figures? International students have now reached a record high of 680,000, and this is primarily because of the 2-year post-graduation work visa being brought in. They are not immigrants. On the whole, they return to their countries. In fact, if you look at the immigration figures, the highest number of students, higher than people who come to work. And it's because the UN says 1 year you have to categorize people as immigrants. Even a 1-year master's degree means an international student is categorized as an immigrant. Other countries exclude them from their net migration figures. Why is the government making a rod for its own back? Why are international students being used in this way? Is it being used to create a fear of migration? Is it being used to create a hostile approach to immigration? I just don't understand it, my lords. I'm like a stuck record. Please, could the Noble Lord the Minister, in his winding up, address this point? and as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Students and president for the UK Council for International Student Affairs, international students bring in £30 billion into this country and are one of our strongest elements of soft power. To conclude, my lords, of course we want to address the asylum claims. 138,000 backlog is unacceptable. We need to process them quicker. Of course we need to address, tackle and stop the illegal immigration and these awful, dangerous, sadly tragic small boats crossing the channel. But let us never take for granted the good immigration that has benefited this country, for which we should always be grateful and always appreciate, because it is the good immigration that has made Great Britain great.
My Lords, it is a privilege to speak following the noble Lord Bilmoria, and particularly on this issue of illegal migration, which cuts right to the core of who we are as a nation. And I want to use my time to ask 3 questions. First, will the stated objective of this bill be achieved? Second, do we have the right target in our sights? And third, are there things that could be done to ensure the new system reflects the values of our nation? So first, will the stated objective of this bill be achieved? My Lords, as we've heard over and over again, the purpose of this bill is to prevent and deter unlawful migration, and in particular migration by unsafe and illegal routes. The fact that this bill has very similar objectives to the previous one requires us to take a hard look at what we are doing and ask ourselves whether it will be effective. My Lords, I agree with the premise, as do most of us in this House, of both last year's bill and this year's illegal migration bill, that we must take back control of our borders and break the business model of people smuggling networks. However, my concern is whether a focus on deterrence will in fact achieve these objectives. The government itself has admitted that the evidence of the efficacy of deterrence measures is limited. So, presuming that this legislation has only limited efficacy and that channel crossings continue in some form or another after this bill has been passed, I ask my noble friend the Minister to outline how His Majesty's Government intends to implement the mass detention of irregular arrivals that will continue, and how they will support those who are not able to be removed after 28 days of detention because of a lack of returns agreement. In international terms, we are taking an unorthodox approach to our asylum system. It is clear that we are not confident this approach will be effective, so I ask my noble friend the Minister whether he would include a review mechanism in this bill so that Parliament has a chance to evaluate the success of this novel approach, and whether, if it proves to be ineffective, to disapply it. The second question I want to raise is whether we have the right target in our sights. With this piece of legislation, our sights are firmly set on the asylum seeker and the trafficked, and not the trafficker. If we were to put as much energy into targeting the real criminals, into imprisoning the criminal gangs, we would be standing on firmer ground. It is not illegal to cross a border and claim asylum. This is a protection set out in the Refugee Convention of 1951. It is us who is choosing to make it illegal. Over 70% of the people who come via these routes are granted asylum by our own system and our own definitions. But we are also dismantling much of the modern-day slavery legislation by going after those being trafficked rather than the traffickers. The removal and exclusion from support of those victims who have been exploited in the UK will drive victims underground, making them less likely to come forward. This will not only hinder victims' recovery, but damage the chances for prosecutions. Without support, and if removed to another country, most victims will be unable to cooperate with investigations. I believe that this House will want to pick up the amendments laid by the Right Honourable Ian Duncan-Smith and Theresa May in the other place. But, my Lords, I'm also wanting to engage constructively with this bill, so I ask whether there are things that could be done to ensure the new system reflects the values of our nation. We have always been a place that welcomes those who are genuinely in need. Our commitment to the refugee is founded on our Christian heritage. There has been much said during the passage of this bill about safe and legal routes. In this chamber, during the passing of the Nationality and Borders Bill, I supported an amendment that would make provision for 10,000 to come to the UK through safe and legal routes as a way of ensuring we created the infrastructure that would care for people properly, rather than us lurching from one emergency situation to another. The government has indicated it is willing to do this, but there are some factors that it would be worth us exploring together as part of this. We will need assurance that these safe and legal routes will be set up to welcome those who need protection, whatever country they come from, and not just country-specific schemes, be that Afghanistan, Yemen, and most recently, Sudan. And we need to work with the grain of local communities and not against them. A recent study from More in Common showed that when community sponsorship of refugees is an option, a majority of people are in favour of accepting more refugees into the UK. Therefore, can I encourage the Minister to explore safe routes that include schemes like Homes for Ukraine that would save the taxpayer millions while also allowing refugees to integrate into British society? And finally, as we've also heard from others tonight, this is all part of a much bigger picture that will only be resolved as we reach for diplomatic solutions. Ultimately, stopping channel crossings and taking back control of our borders can only be achieved through diplomacy, not through domestic legislation. Therefore, I urge the government to negotiate a returns agreement with France and the European Union, and to lead the way in instigating a global solidarity pact with like-minded states that would update the international refugee system and make it fit for the 21st century. I look forward to working as a House to support the government to achieve their stated objective of stopping the boats, but doing so in a way that balances control with compassion. I believe we can find a way to put people smugglers out of business and end the exploitation of vulnerable people, whilst also ensuring that this new chapter in the story of the United Kingdom is founded on international responsibility and human dignity.
Your Lordship's House will have an opportunity to scrutinise this very large and complex bill and its details, so I will focus on general principles. Perversely, although I think this bill is politically, constitutionally and morally an imperative, I agree with the comments of the Noble Lord Paddick and the Noble Lord Green of Deddington. Because within the wider context, it is only because we have a failed and dysfunctional legal migration regime that such a bill is necessary, notwithstanding the geopolitical refugee crisis affecting the rich world. The British people did not vote to take back control of our borders in 2016 for any government to preside over more than 500,000 net migration figures each year, but for special pleading from big business for more cheap foreign labour, for 5 million people on out-of-work benefits, £1.9 billion per week spent in social benefits for working-age people, for welfare dependency, and the stalling of social mobility and productivity, and for pay and training for UK citizens to be reduced over time. And actually I predicted this as Member of Parliament for Peterborough in 2006 in the wake of the European Union Free Movement Directive. I made it clear that there would be serious ramifications on the delivery of public services, and for that I was met by hyperbole and allegations of racism, xenophobia and being a little Englander. But if even Tony Blair conceded that that piece of legislation was in error. I would rather not support this bill, and I do agree that, as other speakers have said, the British people are decent, they are fair, they are compassionate and welcoming. You only need to look at the figures that the ECHR have produced that show that we're the second most welcoming country in Europe for refugees. Who doesn't believe that it takes great courage to cross continents to seek a better life and a better future for our families and children? But it is naive and irresponsible to ignore our obligation to propose solutions based on real-world experience. Responsible government is about difficult choices and competing interests. And that's why the Liberal Democrats' fatal motion is, I'm afraid, both irresponsible and an abdication of our duty to respond to legitimate public concerns about this growing migration crisis. It's naive and foolhardy too not to recognise that, of course, people traffickers will abuse and exploit the loopholes around modern slavery. And I have to say respectfully to my former colleague, the former Prime Minister Theresa May, she perhaps should have a word with the Home Secretary who presided over the drafting of the Modern Slavery Bill in 2015, because to ignore the ramifications and those exploitations, I think, is wrong. That said, I think that the amendments that she's proposed and other noble lords have proposed are certainly worth looking at. I also think that, and it has to be said, that this House has no mandate to block or wreck this bill whatsoever. It is a manifesto commitment from the 2019 general election. It is popular and has public support, and was passed by a significant majority in the other place. I agree with the Right Reverend Prelates that we need to legislate with compassion, but those of us who support the bill are no less caring or empathetic to the real-world horrors of modern slavery and people trafficking. And I have to say, frankly, as an Anglican, I find it dispiriting that the leaders of my own church, who were silent over the impact of 20 years of uncontrolled immigration, should seek to mischaracterise those of us who have the courage to support these bold measures as morally deficient. That is not the case. My penultimate point is this. Much talk has been made of breaking international law. We should not regard supranational legal entities and their obligations as shibboleths and theological tablets never to be questioned. It may be unusual, but our dualist treaty regime in this country preserves the rights and duties of legislators against an overmighty executive and a potentially politicised judiciary. And this House is part of that durable and well understood constitutional settlement. And after all, our first duty is the safety of our own citizens, of whatever background. In conclusion, what we have heard today is much criticism, exaggeration, outrage, and some intemperate language, cries of shame, but very few, if any, real workable alternatives. It is a perfectly noble viewpoint to believe in open borders, mass migration to a country with a population density the highest in Europe, a housing crisis, infrastructure pressures, and a debt mountain. But let's be honest about it. What does that policy really mean? The shame will be to do nothing, to give sustenance to the evil people traffickers, to betray the British people, to betray those who came here legally and hope it will all go away. Well, it won't. I welcome this bill, I support this bill, and I wish ministers well in its possibly quite difficult journey through this House.
My Lords, it's been a long day and I won't detain the House too long before the winding up speeches. However, opportunities to wholeheartedly support the government on its legislation arise perhaps less often than I would ideally wish. When I do so, the government's developed a distressing habit of filleting or spiking the legislation afterwards. However, I'm very confident it won't happen on this occasion, so I do want to take this opportunity to speak strongly in support of this bill. My Lords, the basic principle we must not forget is that a democratic nation-state such as ours has and should have the right to control its borders and determine who gets to live here and on what terms. Until quite recently, this would have been an uncontroversial statement, and in my experience, it still is, the further one gets from London SW1. Still, in recent years, this country did lose that right as regards EU citizens, and the general principle has been subject to sustained attack from those who perhaps don't always see the point of international borders at all. And the result of all this has been the difficulty the government faces in enforcing its immigration laws, and in recent years as very high and unsustainable levels of legal migration. Now, as my noble friend Lord Moreland pointed out, that basic principle, the right to control borders, is of course shaped by the many commitments we've taken on. Our membership of the ECHR, the Refugee Convention and much else, our own sua sponte commitments on modern slavery. But all these commitments must, indeed can, only be implemented in a way that is in accordance with practical reality. Governments don't have the luxury of being content with just words. They must deal in reality, not in concepts. And one obvious reality is that tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of people could establish an asylum claim if they could get to this country, and many want to. So, if we acquiesce in illegal arrivals, the numbers will continue to grow. If we open new legal routes, they will be quickly overwhelmed and we will be back to the illegal ones. It is simply not possible to make what has amounted to an open, unlimited offer to anyone who can get here. And that's why this bill is necessary, and why, if it becomes law, no one who arrives in this country illegally, with some reasonable but limited exceptions, will be allowed to stay here. That principle, contrary to what's been said by some noble lords tonight, that specific principle is strongly supported in this country. Indeed, YouGov polling from March shows it's supported by an absolute majority of public opinion. Now, we're told by some we've heard today that to enshrine these principles in a bill is in some way, and I use words that have been used during the day, is in some way shameful, inhuman, immoral, or even evil. Now, I disagree with that, and I actually rather resent it. It is with the greatest trepidation that I debate morality with the high prelates of the church, but I can't agree that we're not living up to our moral responsibility if some of us in this fallen world come to different judgments about the implications of the words of Jesus in Matthew 25. Or we're told by others on benches opposite that because everyone who gets to these shores has a potentially huge contribution to make to this country, it is immoral and self-defeating to turn them away. Of course, I agree that every person who comes here has the same potential as every other human being. I don't think any of us believes that asylum seekers are bad people. They are people doing the best for themselves and their families. But everyone who gets here imposes a burden as well as makes a contribution. And some communities, it is true to say, have integrated into British society and life better than others. It is the job of the government and of the British people to decide where the line should be drawn, and this bill draws one element of it. There's nothing immoral in that. Or if you think there is, you must think it's immoral for British governments to pay proper attention to the views of their own citizens. We've also heard that the right way forward is to renegotiate the international framework covering refugees. That's certainly desirable, but anyone who thinks it could be done in the short term, or perhaps at all, on terms that we would wish to see, is kidding themselves, I'm afraid. The same is true of those who think spending vast sums on development or on mitigating so-called climate migration is going to do anything to deal with the real problem we now face now. My Lords, all the arguments against this bill are, I'm sure, based on deep reflection and conviction, but in the end, I can't think that they really deal with the real-world problem. The real-world choice that faces this government is simple. It's to choose to put in place an organised set of provisions for a limited number of genuine refugees in numbers that this country can cope with and make clear that others will not be able to stay, or it's to live with the current and worsening situation, an open-ended but de facto constrained arrangement for refugee arrivals, constrained not by any rational arrangements or judgments, but by the readiness of those poor trafficked people to travel, to pay, to deal with criminals and bear terrible risks. My Lords, there will certainly be important technical improvements we can make to this bill. This House should certainly give it proper scrutiny, but none of that removes the real need for the fundamental principles behind this bill. I urge the government not to be deterred by the arguments they've heard today, but to push on with the bill and strain all the sinews of the state to deliver on it when it becomes law.
My Lords, I want to thank the House for allowing me to speak in the gap. Only days ago, the King made solemn commitments to justice, to equity, and to mercy. And here we are dismissing those values in this bill. I find it repugnant to hear the spurious use of market force values as an argument for this bill, that the need to crush traffickers, the supply side, involves having to crush demand, as though the demand were not human beings with needs, often people who've been persecuted, people who've watched other members of their family being slaughtered, who have suffered torture themselves, who've witnessed the women in their family being raped. But we have to crush demand. So to devise a scheme as cruel and as vicious as possible is necessary to deflect people from crossing. We have to devise a scheme that has no due process, which has been one of the fundamentals in our rule of law. And we are going to lump together those who are asylum seekers with possibly those amongst them who might be simply here to better themselves, which Lord Frost has just talked about, but described those people as being asylum seekers. The conflation between those who might be coming for economic reasons and those who are asylum seekers fleeing persecution is one of the problems about this bill. I really wanted to speak to the fact that this bill is having a huge impact on our global reputation. I am the director of an institute for the International Bar Association, and so I travel to conferences regularly. I was only last week at the UN in New York. And judges and lawyers talk to me about their concerns about what is happening around issues of law in our country. They say, what's happening to Britain? The Britain has led the world in championing the rule of law, that was the flagship nation in creating the rules-based order after World War II, that drafted the European Convention on Human Rights, was key to so many conventions, including the Refugee Convention, and created, in fact, the model for the modern slavery legislation that's being taken up in other countries too. We've always looked to Britain, they say, as a beacon that we've all been persuading our countries to follow. But what's happening? And so we're putting at risk that reputation. Our stature in the world will be greatly damaged by bills like this and our dismissal of our treaty obligations, our commitment to international law. And the fear that is expressed is that Britain, by showing a reckless disregard for law, will in fact bring about the collapse of that rules-based system, because other countries, authoritarianism is growing, as we know, in so many places, will be only too happy to follow suit. And I remind us all of the law of unintended consequences, that once you start unraveling these things, like, for example, Rule 39, which has allowed us to, we've used ourselves since the year 2005. We've used it only last year in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it will be used as evidence that they have failed to comply with it when we come to bring people like Putin before international courts for war crimes. So please don't unravel law, which has been so important in creating a unity across the globe, which has been so vital in securing justice and in our attempts to secure peace. So I advocate what the Archbishop has advocated, which is that we actually cling to those international obligations and sets of principles, that we make use of them and engage with other countries to try and meet the challenges here, and that we set up proper, swift systems to determine who are asylum seekers and who are not. And I hope this bill will be amended out of existence, because it is unworkable, it's unlawful, and it is immoral, I say to all of you. And we have to ask ourselves, is this what we're standing for in the world? Yeah.
opportunity to speak in the gap, and it's an honour to follow Noble Baroness Lady Kennedy once again. I will focus my comments on pregnant migrant women, and a lot has been said already by Lord Cashman, Baroness Lister, Right Reverend Bishop of Gloucester, Baroness Sugg and Baroness Brinton and many others. Like them, I am gravely concerned about the safety of pregnant women, new mothers and their babies. The legislation in its current form may result in them being detained indefinitely and being taken out of the UK. Pregnant women and new mothers are amongst the most vulnerable in society, and we have a duty to safeguard them. We therefore need to provide them the right nutrition, the right health care, the right physical and mental health monitoring to detect problems. And making them stay in overcrowded centres can increase the risk in infectious disease, result in poor mental health. They cannot be provided the right care at the right time. Why can't these small numbers of pregnant migrant women be housed in the community? I say that because this morning the Minister mentioned that most illegal migrants are men. Also, what risks can these pregnant women pose in society? If I remember rightly this morning, it was mentioned that the measures in this bill are needed to keep us safe. And the government already have a terrible record when it comes to pregnant women who are detained. For example, women in prison have up to 7 times a higher probability of suffering stillbirth than in the general population. Pregnant women who were returning from abroad during the COVID pandemic were put at risk when the government made them stay in quarantine hotels. I want to remind this House of what happened to Amina Bibi when she returned from Pakistan. She was in a quarantine hotel. She asked for help, and someone decided that she'd gone to the hospital too many times, and at 34 weeks she lost her baby, nearly bled to death, and was in intensive care. As my lords will be aware, there has been a lot of publicity on maternity disparities, and I want to declare an interest as the CEO of Muslim Women's Network UK and officer of the APPG on Muslim women. We produced a report on maternity disparities, and that report, like many other maternity reports and the statistics on maternity care, show one thing very clearly, that minoritised women and their babies have a higher mortality rate. These women are more likely to have a miscarriage. Women born outside of the UK are more likely to have worse maternity outcomes. Now, the government has pledged to address these maternity inequalities. So then, how can, on one hand, the government then say it will reduce harm for pregnant women, while on the other hand, bring in legislation that will create a system that will cause harm to pregnant women and their babies? It is cruel, heartless and humane. So, Lord Frost, I am using those words again, and I don't apologise for them. The medical and maternity experts all state that the government proposals are putting pregnant women and their babies at risk of physical and mental harm. Among them are Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Royal College of Midwives, Doctors of the World, Maternity Action, and many more. My lords, this disregard of expert opinion and of safeguarding is shameful. Timely, safe and adequate maternity care can only be received if pregnant women were living in the community. My noble Lord Farmer mentioned earlier that the UK could become a magnet for pregnant women. I respectfully and strongly disagree with that point. So therefore I urge the government to do the right thing and not to detain pregnant women.
My lords, the House will forgive me for not name-checking individual noble lords. I've heard it said a number of times of this bill, this is not who we are as a nation, nor is it how I used to think of the Conservative Party. I rarely agreed with them, but I respected them. I look to the government to lead, not stoke up both prejudice and fear. These are human beings who, in very, very large part, are fleeing conflict, torture, persecution and danger. Human beings as we are, but I see no attempt to walk in their shoes, to see each as an individual with his own character and history, each child as a child, and many of them vulnerable. The minister wrote to peers saying, I quote, "As you will know, over 45,000 people illegally crossed the channel in small boats last year, abusing our laws and asylum protections. No, I don't know 45,000 people did that. I do know this is victim blaming. And I want to acknowledge the Refugees Welcome and other support groups and individuals who see asylum seekers as people in need of support. I know this bill is immoral. It's presented as moral. We must save people from the dangers of the channel. Well, of course, but even if it will, what about the dangers from which asylum seekers are escaping? The very presentation of some so-called safe countries designated in the bill as safe for men or women only indicates the government does know the human rights problems, but there are no nuances, no caveats. Safe and legal routes are not, as suggested, irrelevant. They should be the precursor to legislation. The bill is misconceived. It won't act as a deterrent to asylum seekers, so it won't deter the traffickers. It will create a new market for smugglers among people removed to countries which are not appropriate. The Modern Slavery Act should be strengthened, not weakened. In January, changes were introduced to address false slavery claims by bringing into force the Nationality and Borders Act. It is far too soon to assess those changes. Allowing a victim to remain in the UK just so long as is necessary for a prosecution says a good deal about the government's refusal, against professional opinion, to understand that few victims are able to produce a complete statement without considerable support, often over a long period. Trauma-informed? Noble lords have spoken of giving traffickers another tool. Go to the police and you'll be removed from the UK. Why cast asylum seekers as the wrongdoers? Overstayers who had visas know they have no right to be here. They outnumber asylum seekers by many times. And of course, we've heard a lot about total migration numbers. I'm grateful for the mention of the report by the Select Committee, which I'm lucky enough to chair, as the way the government should go on immigration. The government used to be good at soft power. What a clever strategy to seek to load things on our nearest European neighbours. This refusal to acknowledge the global situation, to address what might truly be a fair share, is the very opposite of seeking global cooperation. And it's more than a closed door, it's drawing up the portcullis. There's deep concern about the impacts on the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It's not apparent that the government considered or consulted on this. And how is this bill perceived by minority communities in the UK? Let's not forget community cohesion and integration. It's clear that the benefits of diversity pass the government by. The bill is illegal and the House will, as always, be glad of its lawyers. Just take its retrospective effect. Legal certainty requires clarity at the relevant time, which is not in this case, the 7th of March 2023, with Parliament at that point being taken for granted. It's a central tenet of the rule of law. The Court of Appeal called it a requirement of good administration by which public bodies ought to deal straightforwardly and consistently with the public. The Minister says the Section 19 position is legally untested. I thought the government was rather critical of people running off to the courts to test legality and of the courts treading where the government thinks they shouldn't. I confess there's a good deal about the bill that puzzles me. I rely on a writ of habeas corpus, which is about the lawfulness of detention, when the legislation makes the detention legal. And that the party that claimed to be good housekeepers does not focus, first of all, on the efficiency of the Home Office. Detention used as instant punishment before any infringement is established, legal avenues blocked, and the courts blocked from getting on with their job to a proper timetable. And what happened to necessity and proportionality? I could almost say, thank goodness the bill will be unworkable, but for what it will mean for so many children and adults, not even as good as having a life on hold, driven towards exploitation, not protected from it, driven to the underground economy. How much will we know of this? Presumably the numbers won't appear in the Home Office applications backlog because the claims will be inadmissible and so not counted. Immoral, misconceived, illegal. It's obviously not possible to cover every point made in a few minutes, as the many organisations who've briefed us so extensively will realise, and to whom we'll continue to look at later stages. A fundamentally unacceptable bill doesn't become acceptable by amending it at the edges. The Parliament Act is a red herring. Even if there were time to ram the same bill through, it's not that straightforward, there would be no time for implementation before the next election. And to those who say that opponents of the bill should be setting out their policy, I'm sure they would have said in response to speeches setting out policy that this wasn't the time, especially given the bill's short and long titles. By the way, our policy is not to admit everyone. Like the Most Reverend Primate, my noble friend did not say we would. Finally, perhaps the most egregious aspect of the bill, it deprives people of hope, and hope is so precious. My lords, my own default mode is to look for compromise and consensus, but I can't do so here. I feel contaminated by this bill.
My lords, I too won't be attempting to name-check everyone who's spoken in this debate. It's been a fascinating but a worrying debate, and I'd like to thank all the many briefing organisations that have sent briefings, many of which have been referred to during the debate. My lords, the head note for understanding this bill is that it attacks the ability of people to come to the UK irregularly and claim asylum or make human rights claims. It shuts them out and imposes a duty of removal. In the absence of agreements on removal or readmission to their home or third countries, the people will remain in the UK without status, either in detention, potentially for an indefinite period of time, or supported at public expense because they are unable to work. It manufactures a growing and potentially permanent population of people in the UK who are, for all practical purposes, unremovable and who are a burden on the public purse. It is ineffective and it breaches international treaty commitments. The bill contains a number of things that disrupt the established relationship between the government and the courts. For example, it revises the ability to seek liberty from being unlawfully detained. It also removes protection from people who are victims of trafficking in order that they may be treated as irregular arrivals as well. In the media, you will see that the motivation for this bill is the problem created by people crossing the English Channel in small boats. But in reality, the bill affects all people arriving irregularly. It also extends to human rights claims made by EU citizens in the UK, and that can affect their family life and their private life rights. I think this is a point which was made by the Noble Lord, Lord Etherton. I believe this will create additional problems in our relationships with EU member states. My lords, all people in this House would agree that small boat crossings should be stopped. Smugglers are profiting from the desperation of people risking their lives to reach our shores. Also, my lords, there is no doubt as to the size of the challenge in dealing with the number of asylum seekers already stuck in the system, as well as those currently making their way here right now. The main question we should address ourselves to when looking at this bill is, will it make things better or will it make them worse? Will this bill stop the dangerous crossings and lead to serious consequences for the people smugglers? Will this bill protect those most at risk from exploitation, violence and torture? Does it protect children? Does it help those who we have made promises to, like Afghan interpreters who missed the last flight from Kabul? Will this bill ensure we create safe routes they say asylum seekers must use instead of using channel crossings, but safe routes which hardly exist at all? Does this bill deal with the large backlog of asylum claims which continue to build up, and will it prevent people from getting stuck in accommodation and hotels, waiting seemingly indefinitely for their asylum decision? Does this bill maintain our long-standing commitments to international cooperation and law? Does it maintain our international reputation as a fair country that takes our role in the international community seriously? Members across the House have provided many answers to those questions. They have said this bill will not help, it will hurt, and it is indeed a worrying bill. It will further damage our asylum system, trap more people in limbo within it, and result in even higher costs. It will hurt children, traffic men and women, and those fleeing war who are unable to take safe routes to get here. It will hurt our international reputation and our reputations with countries across the world. It won't provide real consequence for the people smugglers profiting from human misery on our shores. My Lords, we will work across the House to amend this bill so we maintain the current levels of judicial oversight, we live up to our international obligations, and we maintain the original principles of the Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to all noble lords who have spoken today. It is a measure of the importance of the issue before us that there have been some 80 speakers in this debate. As we've heard from noble lords across the House, as well as from my right honourable friends, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, it is clear that we must stop the boats. That much, at least, is common ground. Our approach is driven by a desire to do right by the people of this country. And it is guided by that most British of principles, fairness. Because the present situation is anything but fair. The case for decisive action could not be clearer. I say again, ours is a generous and compassionate country. We will continue offering sanctuary and refuge to those fleeing persecution, conflict, and tyranny. But what we will not accept is mass illegal migration to our shores. And that is why we need this bill to stop the boats and address this challenge once and for all. I turn now to the matters raised in the debate, including the points addressed in the amendment moved by the noble Lord, Lord Paddick. First, the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and other noble lords were right to place the bill in its moral context. Proceeding with this bill is the moral course. We must put a stop to the dangerous channel crossings, putting lives at risk and splitting families. We must end the callous exploitation of vulnerable people by the people smugglers, and we must uphold the law and ensure fair play for those who abide by our immigration rules. A number of noble lords commented on the fact that on the introduction of this bill in your Lordship's House, I made a statement under Section 19(1)(b) of the Human Rights Act. I think it's fair to say that there has been a misunderstanding as to the effect of a Section 19(1)(b) statement. We have designed a scheme that is novel and ambitious. As a result, we have made a Section 19(1)(b) statement under that Act. This simply makes clear that we cannot say definitively that we will win a challenge in Strasbourg. However, we are confident that Strasbourg will respect the will of Parliament and our domestic court processes. We make no apologies for taking this approach. This is what the situation demands and what the British public expect. Section 19(1)(b) statements have been made by governments of all stripes. I might add, one was made by the then Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, when bringing forward the House of Lords Reform Bill in 2012. Tessa Jowell similarly made a Section 19(1)b statement in what became the Communications Act 2003. It is noteworthy that when that act was later challenged in the European Court of Human Rights, that court found in the Animal Defenders case that there was no violation of the Convention. A number of noble lords, including the noble Lord Lord Cashman and the noble Baroness Lady Ludford, argued that this bill breaches our international obligations. There were some equally forthright contributions making the contrary, and in my view, very persuasive case from my noble friends Lord Howard of Lympney, Lord Lamont, Lord Wolfson King's Counsel, Lord Sandhurst King's Counsel, drawing some of them on the work of Professor Eakins King's Counsel and others at Policy Exchange who've written extensively on this topic. The government takes its international obligations, including under the ECHR, very seriously, and there is nothing in the bill, including in Clause 53, that requires the UK to breach its international obligations. In any event, it is not correct that a failure to comply with interim measures invariably involves a breach of international law. There are exceptional circumstances where non-compliance with an interim measure is not a breach of international law. The noble Baroness Lady Lister and the Right Reverend the Bishop of Durham and the noble Lord Lord Alton, amongst others, argued that the bill breaches the Refugee Convention. I can assure the House that we are satisfied the provisions in the bill comply with the Refugee Convention. It is a long-standing principle that those in need of protection should claim asylum at the earliest opportunity in the first safe country they reach. This is an established part of international asylum procedures and applied across the EU, such as through the Common European Asylum System. This concept seeks to ensure that migration from safe countries does not undermine concerted efforts to help those most in need. Plainly, all illegal arrivals across the Channel come from a safe country, mostly France. As my noble friend Lord Dobbs and the noble and learned Lord Brown of Eton under Hayward rightly pointed out, their lives are not in danger in France, and they are taking the place of those in genuine need. In December, the High Court upheld the lawfulness of this principle, that those in need of protection should claim asylum in the first safe country they reach, concluding that the government can relocate asylum seekers to Rwanda for their claims to be determined by Rwanda rather than by the United Kingdom. We look forward to the Court of Appeal's judgment on this question in the near future. I think this addresses the concerns in this regard expressed by various noble lords, including Lord Brown of Ladyton, Lord Howarth of Newport, and the noble Baroness Lady Jones. We have always made clear that no one will be returned or removed to a country where they may be persecuted. This will not change. The noble Lord, Lord Jermyn, argued that in disapplying Section 3 of the Human Rights Act 1998, the bill was transferring powers from Parliament and the courts to the Secretary of State. My lords, the opposite is the case. The Human Rights Act, especially Section 3, has in some cases shifted the balance away from Parliament towards the courts. We are already proposing to repeal Section 3 of the Human Rights Act in the Bill of Rights, so our courts are no longer required by that Act to rewrite legislation passed by this Parliament. Ahead of wider reforms to our human rights framework, we are implementing this disapplication to the provisions of this bill to avoid courts adopting an interpretation which is inconsistent with Parliament's intentions. A number of noble peers, including my noble friend Baroness Hellich, have been labouring under a misapprehension that the bill removes judicial oversight. I would gently invite those who think this carefully to read the relevant clauses of the bill. In all cases, individuals will have the opportunity to make suspensive claims with judicial oversight in the upper tribunal. These claims are suspensive of removal. In all cases, individuals can institute other legal challenges, including judicial reviews on human rights grounds, in the normal way. However, these claims are non-suspensive of removal. These claims can continue remotely, as they have done historically for other immigration claims, for example, in the case of the refusal of a spousal entry clearance application. I might also add that the bill provides for continued judicial oversight of detention, as it will be open to any detainee at any time to apply to the High Court for a writ of habeas corpus or its equivalent in Scotland. Many noble lords, including the noble Lord Hunt of King's Heath, question whether there is evidence of the misuse of our modern slavery protections. The modern slavery clauses are fundamentally about preventing dangerous and illegal crossings that pose a threat to public order. However, it is clear that the national referral mechanism offers world-leading protections to victims of modern slavery, and we must be alert to the risk that these protections will be used to frustrate removal action. Last year, 17,000 referrals took on average 543 days to reach a conclusive grounds decision, making modern slavery protections susceptible to misuse. Modern slavery referrals from detention and prison have also increased. In 2020, 27%, that's 1,005, of the people detained within the UK following immigration offences were referred as potential victims of modern slavery. And only 1% of individuals detained within the UK following an immigration offence who made a modern slavery claim, only 1% of individuals who were detained within the UK following an immigration offence who made a modern slavery claim were returned. The NRM referral rate for people arriving in the UK on small boats and being detained for return has risen from 6%, 50 people, of detentions ending in 2019 to 73% in 2021. The referral rate has since fallen slightly to 65% between January to September 2022. In contrast, where people were not detained for return, less than 3% of people who arrived in the UK on small boats in 2021 were referred to the NRM within 3 months of entering the UK. Modern slavery laws are therefore an inextricable part of an immigration system that is open to being misused in order to block removals. My noble friends, Lady Mubarak and Lady Stroud, as well as other noble lords, including the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, expressed concerns about the impact of the bill on victims of modern slavery. The government is committed to tackling the heinous crime of modern slavery and supporting victims. The bill ensures that individuals who arrive in the UK illegally will no longer have the potential to misuse modern slavery protections to thwart their removal from the UK. The measures are not a blanket approach. If a person needs to stay in the UK to help support an investigation into and the prosecution of their people traffickers, they will be exempt. If someone is identified as a potential victim of modern slavery, the government will ensure that they are safely returned to their home country where possible, or to another safe third country like Rwanda. This will mean that trafficking victims are given modern slavery support and traffickers can be brought to justice, while preventing people from abusing our modern slavery laws. These provisions are consistent with our international obligations. Indeed, under Article 13 of ECHR, the UK has a right to disqualify individuals who pose a threat to public order. However, we recognise that this is a significant step, and this is why the modern slavery provisions in the bill are time-limited. Unless renewed, they will cease to apply after 2 years. As many as a good many noble lords, including my noble friend Lord Vaughan of Aberystwyth, argued, the solution to the more small boats problem is to open up more safe and legal routes. I am sorry to say that this is, of itself, no answer. The UK has a long and proud history of supporting refugees, and we are committed to maintaining clear, well-defined, global, safe and legal routes for people in need of protection. The UK, working with the UNHCR, currently operates a number of safe and legal routes which support people directly from regions of conflict and instability. In addition, we operate the country-specific schemes for those who are eligible from Afghanistan, Ukraine and Hong Kong. But with worldwide refugee displacement, as observed during the debate, now standing at around 100 million, the United Kingdom cannot help everyone, a point, I think, on which there is agreement around much of the House. It is important to add that those seeking protection should claim asylum in the first safe country. This is the fastest route to safety. The Prime Minister has committed to introduce a cap on the number of people coming via safe and legal routes, which will be based on the capacity of our local authorities, agreed by Parliament, and amendable in the event of humanitarian crises. The bill delivers this, and I welcome the support from the front bench opposite for the principle of a cap. I too well remember the Most Reverend Prelate for proposing such a cap during his debate in December. The cap is necessary if we are to ensure that the number of individuals we welcome through safe and legal routes do not exceed the capacity of the UK to integrate and accommodate them effectively, a point well made by my noble friend Lord Farmer in respect of stretched children's services. This is the right way to ensure that we can continue to provide sanctuary to those in need of international protection as part of a well-managed and sustainable migration system. As now provided for in the bill, the Government will publish a report within 6 months of royal assent on current and any proposed additional safe and legal routes. And I repeat, we will implement those new routes by the end of next year. A number of noble lords, including the noble Lord Scriven and the noble Baroness Lady Brinton, argued for the exclusion of children from the duty to remove or the detention powers in the bill. We also heard calls to exclude pregnant women from the detention powers. I'm glad to tell the House that to date there have been very few pregnant women in the small boats. Let me say to the House that such a move would only serve to incentivise the people smugglers to target particular groups or those with certain characteristics. The result could well be that more children and pregnant women are put into flimsy boats, putting more young lives at risk, splitting up families and encouraging adults to make false claims that they are a child. I can assure your Lordship's House that families will be kept together wherever possible, and that children will be detained for as short a period as possible, in age-appropriate accommodation. Moreover, as we have already made clear, our policy is not to arrange to remove unaccompanied children before they turn 18, save in very limited circumstances, as now set out on the face of the bill. For example, for the purpose of reunion with a parent, or where removal is to a safe country of origin. They may only be detained in specific circumstances to be prescribed in regulations. On the issue of detention more broadly, contrary to what a number of noble lords opposite have said, the bill does not provide for indefinite detention. It does enable detention for the purposes of removal, and in doing so codifies in part the long-standing common law principles governing immigration detention, including that a person may only be detained for a period that is reasonable in all the circumstances. They will not be, as the noble Baroness Lady Chakrabarti put it, interned in legal limbo indefinitely. The noble Baroness Lady Lister expressed concerns regarding the provision strengthening scientific age assessment methods. It is critical that the government takes action to disincentivise individuals who are deliberately misrepresenting their ages in order to cheat the system, as well as protecting genuine children. Determining the age of a young person is an inherently difficult task, and we are aware that no single age assessment method, scientific or not, which can determine an individual's age with precision. However, we believe that considering a wider range of evidence will enable more informed and robust decisions. I can assure the House that regulations under Clause 56 will not be made to introduce an automatic assumption of adulthood until the science is sufficiently accurate to support such a finding. Moreover, the assumption will only be applied in the circumstances set out in regulations if an individual refuses to undergo the scientific age assessment without good reason. It is important to note that negative consequences, such as automatic assumptions, are applied with variations by ECHR signatories, including the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. So it is the UK which is the outlier, as one of very few European countries that does not currently employ scientific methods such as X-rays as part of age assessments. The Noble Lord, Lord Coker, and others asked about the detention capacity required to give effect to the bill. The purpose of the bill is to deter people from coming to the UK illegally, as they know they will be swiftly returned to their home country if it is safe to do so, or to a safe third country. When the bill is implemented, this will mean that numbers will start to come down, and that will reduce pressure on accommodation and services in the UK. We are absolutely committed to making this legislation work and to find further solutions to scale up our detention capacity. But the first step is this change in the law, and which is why we are focused on getting this bill through the House. Various noble lords challenge the deterrent effect of the bill. We've always said there is no one single solution to the global migration crisis, and certainly no overnight fix. But doing nothing is not an option. The bill will remove the incentive to pay criminal gangs and attempt dangerous channel crossings in the hopes of settling in the UK. The bill's provisions are designed to deter such dangerous and illegal activity. The Noble Lord Horam reminded us of the instructive Australian experience of what happens when illegal routes are rendered unviable. And as the noble and learned Lord Brown of Eton under Hayward correctly warned, every amendment to soften the bill will weaken its objectives. My noble friend Baroness Lawler put it well. This bill is stringent, but necessary and proportionate. But it is not the only step we're taking. It comes alongside our partnership with Rwanda, bolstered enforcement action to bear down on the criminal gangs, and then there is the cooperation with France, as my noble friend Lord Howard of Lympney rightly pointed out. My lords, this government will always act in the interests of the law-abiding majority. That means that securing our borders, it means delivering a fair and effective immigration and asylum system, and it means stopping the boats. Enough is enough. The British people want this problem dealt with. This bill will enable us to do exactly that, and I commend it to the House and invite noble lords to reject the amendment, standing in the name of the noble Lord, Lord Paddick.
My Lords, our reasoned amendment sets out why this House should decline to give this bill a second reading. Contrary to the assertions made by the noble Lord the Minister, we believe the bill undermines the rule of law by failing to meet the United Kingdom's international law commitments and by allowing ministers to ignore the directions of judges. It undermines the UK's tradition of providing sanctuary to refugees by removing the ability of refugees to exercise their rights, their legal right to claim asylum, by removing protections afforded to modern slavery victims, and by increasing the number of people in indefinite detention, including children. It fails to provide safe and legal routes for refugees. It fails to include measures to eliminate the backlog of asylum cases, and it fails to include measures to tackle people smuggling gangs. I'm grateful to my noble friend Baroness Thomas of Winchester for pointing out that when in 2007 the former Labour government passed the Fraud Trials Without a Jury bill in the other place, by a similar majority to this bill, the House of Lords carried a fatal motion at second reading. The bill was never reintroduced. The list of those noble lords who voted against its second reading is illuminating. and included 2 bishops. The noble Lord Forsyth of Drumlene, who earlier today described overturning the will of the other place as, and I quote, a complete abuse of this House, and I quote, and I didn't think any members of this House who respects the rules of this House and its role could possibly go through the lobbies and vote for that amendment, must have had a road to Damascus experience. No, I'm not going to give way. I'm sorry. No.
I'm grateful to the noble lord. I'm sure he wouldn't want to mislead the House. He's obviously looked into that matter. That motion was that the consideration of second reading should be deferred by 6 months, not that the bill should be destroyed.
And the noble lord will know exactly what Erskine May says about the motion that was passed, which is that Parliament considers that to be a fatal motion against the bill. That's what Erskine May says. And 123 other Conservatives also voted in favour of refusing the bill a second reading, including 59 who are still sitting members of this House. Perhaps they have also changed their minds. And perhaps when they find themselves in opposition, they'll change their minds again. My Lords, if I thought this bill would stop the boats, I would not seek to divide this House. But it is not likely to stop the boats. This bill is all pain and no gain. This is a question of principle, and I wish to test the opinion of the House.
The question is that the amendment in the name of Lord Paddick be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. I think the not contents have it. The matter will be decided by a division. I will advise the House when the voting is open. Voting is now open. Clear the VAR.